Good evening all and welcome, and thank you all so much for being here. It means a lot that you choose to watch this channel. I have a chilling collection of scary stories in the rain for you to enjoy, and I'd like to give a special thank you to our big patron of the month, Mortis Mike, for his kindness and generosity. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I am a 29-year-old female and was 21 and working for KFC as a manager when this occurred. I had the closing shift. Our store closed at 10 p.m. and I got out shortly after closing, which was pretty rare, but we had had an unusually quiet night. We had a lot of leftover chicken and company policy was to throw it away. Now, my boyfriend worked for the state police headquarters in the city that we lived in, and was working nights. So I decided to bring him and his workmates the leftover chicken instead of just throwing it out. I still recorded the food as wasted and followed protocol, just accidentally put it in my car instead of the trash. It was a good 45-minute drive from the store I worked in to the city center where my boyfriend worked, but I blasted my music and just enjoyed the drive and de-stressed from a long day. I pulled up next to the side entrance to the police headquarters and messaged my boyfriend that I was there with some chicken. He replied that he wasn't actually in that building, but was helping out with some tech difficulties elsewhere. I knew the building he's at fairly well because he's worked there before, so I say I'd bring it over. This other building faces a large park that's in the middle of the city. The streets aren't particularly well lit or busy near this building, especially late at night, because there are no bars or restaurants, mostly office buildings and apartments. I park next to the side entrance/loading zone, but under a street light at the top of the street, and text my boyfriend that I'm here with the food. He says he'll be down in 15 minutes. He is just in the middle of something, and at this point, I've been in my car for over an hour or so I get out just to stretch a little. As soon as I do, I notice a person walking towards me. I can't quite tell if they are male or female because they are halfway down the street from where I am, and I'm in the light, and they are not. But I can see it's a pretty solid person, so I assume it's probably a man. This was confirmed 2 seconds after, when he calls out to me, "Hey beautiful, what you doing?" I immediately feel uncomfortable and don't reply. I reasoned that if I ignored him and don't give him the attention he's after, he'll probably just leave me alone. Oh, how wrong I was. He keeps calling out to me, and I decide to ignore him. He's still a fair distance off, but closing in on me, so I decide to get back in my car. I figure I want something in between him and I. As soon as I open my door, he runs straight up to me. I jump in my car and lock it immediately. He gets to my car astonishingly fast. I drop my keys on the floor in a panic to try and start it to drive away. He tries to open my door, realizes it's locked, and then just starts punching my door and screaming at me. I am crying at this point and frozen in fear. He's hitting my car with such force that he cracks my windscreen, and I start to scream in terror that he's going to break through and get to me. He must have split open his hand on his assault of the car, because at this point there is also blood all over it. The whole time he's punching it, he's screaming at me, "I want it. I know you want it. Stop being such a cow." I'm close to hysterics, and then suddenly he stops screaming and presses his face up on the window and is just staring at me. I am avoiding looking at him and desperately trying not to give in to full-blown panic. His face disappears, and I hear other voices now. My boyfriend and his co-worker have come down to retrieve the chicken, and the guy just legs it into the darkness of the park. My boyfriend is a big dude and works for police, but isn't actually a police officer. However, the uniform he wore for work was really similar, and in the dark you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference, so that's probably what made him leg it. I made a statement to police, but he was never caught, or if he was, I was never told. Hands down, the scariest encounter I've ever had. I was driving home from my then girlfriend's house around midnight. It was summertime and very hot, and had rained earlier that evening, so it was kind of foggy. I had to drive down Route 17, which is a really old road that ran from where I lived to where she lived. It also passed through Burkittsville, the town where the Blair Witch Project came from. I was driving through the area that was mostly old rundown farms. The road has a lot of sharp turns in them, so you have to go slow, and I was going through a turn and through the fog, when all of a sudden I see an old man walking across the street. I slammed on the brakes and braced myself for the impact, because I knew there was no way I was going to stop in time. I remember the old man turned and looked right at me as the car was about to plow into him. He opened his mouth wide and looked like he was going to scream no. But as my car hit the area where he was, it vanished. The car finally skidded and came to a stop. I wasn't sure what the hell just happened, but I didn't hear a thump on my car, so I immediately got out of there and was looking around for a body, but didn't see anything. I went to the front of my car and didn't see any damage. I walked behind my car a few feet away and couldn't see anything. I must have walked about 40 or 50 feet and started freaking out, and then I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the darkness. I pretty much almost crapped myself at this point and sprinted back to my car. I told my mum the story the next morning, and just telling the story gave me goosebumps. My mum, who normally doesn't believe in the paranormal, looked at my arms and said, "Just by your reaction, I believe you." To this day, I'm not sure what I saw. It could have just been the fog, but it seemed so real to me. I found out later on that I was not the only person to claim to see an old man crossing the road. I live in a little city in SoCal with my roommate who happens to be my cousin. During this coronavirus pandemic, I've been staying with my parents who live in a very small town in NorCal. Because of my time in SoCal, I really do not like staying in NorCal, and I would rather live back in my apartment. The reason why I haven't is because my parents think I will get very lonely there since everything is closed and my roommate is not there, as he's also staying with his parents. However, since I had to go back for a specific reason, my parents wanted me to take their dog, Mocha, so I wouldn't feel as lonely staying there. I loved her and didn't mind one bit. Mocha is a small, pomchy dog that loves to play around with me and usually is by my side for most of the time. She also loves to go on runs with me, so I occasionally do take her on jogs. On a Wednesday night, I decided to go running with her. Whenever I go on any runs, I go at night, because that's the time I am most energetic, and all the times I went running at night, I never had any type of encounter or occurrences. I put Mocha on a leash and we went out. About 20 minutes into our run, I was running through this creek. There was a park next to it, and a bunch of trees surrounding it. Houses to the other side. The trail was pretty narrow, and the street lamps were pretty dim, but still bright enough to see up ahead. As I'm running with music playing, my leash was tugged by Mocha. This usually happens when she wants to go to the bathroom, so I stopped to let her do her thing. But when I turned around, she was in her alert stance, looking straight behind me, where we had ran. I just assumed that she heard a squirrel or any small animal as she usually does. I was tugging her leash, telling her to let go and that there's nothing there. She didn't oblige at first. She kept looking behind us. It took about 4 to 5 tugs before she finally came to me. I resumed playing my music and we both went off running. I was almost out the creek, and then I would meet a narrow sidewalk that was straight ahead. The trail only had to take a short turns, Probably a minute or two later, Mocha tugged the leash again and went on her alert stance behind me. She did an aggressive bark and started growling. I stopped and was looking all around behind us. I was kind of freaked out because the trail had a couple of turns and curves. This meant that something was most likely following us. My first guess was a lost dog, which is unsettling as Mocha is tiny. If it were a big dog, I can easily overpower her. As I was looking around the dim area for a split second, I saw a black humanoid figure 15 yards away, right behind a bush next to a tree. I immediately turned my eyes to the opposite direction, and pretending that I did not see him, but boy, my heart was pounding. I didn't see any figures or his face, just the outline of his upper body. I didn't have a weapon of any sort. If this guy was following me, my best solution would be to run off without him catching me. I tried to act cool and told Mocha we should go. The trail was going to end, and I just had to make a turn, and it would be a straight sidewalk about 300 to 400 yards. There are fences on both sides of the sidewalk, so the only solution was to keep running forwards. I went at a jog right as I turned the corner and made sure that I was out of view from the person as I went into a full-on sprint as quietly as I could. The sidewalk was ahead of me, so I made sure just to keep running and kept looking behind me to see if I was really being followed. About 70 yards away, I saw a person come to view from the turn, then went sprinting as fast as he could towards me. As if I wasn't sprinting, I went sprinting as fast as I could, and I never have sprinted that fast in my life. Looking back, it amazed me on how fast I ran. Mocha was actually keeping up with me about 100 yards of sprinting. I looked back, and he was still full on running behind me. He was wearing a dark hoodie, sweatpants, and appeared to be at least 6 foot tall. He was still in that same distance that I noticed him from, which meant he must have been pretty fast as well. The sidewalk was going to end at about 100 yards, and it would lead to a neighborhood. I can lose him there. I was slowly getting out of breath. My adrenaline was beginning to die down. I kept sprinting, hoping I wouldn't get tired too quickly. 100 yards of me sprinting, and I finally made it to the neighborhood out of breath. This neighborhood was pretty broad, so if I were to keep running, the person would have spotted me right away, and the pace he was running, it didn't seem like a good idea. My solution was to hide. I went straight to a random house, jumped over their backyard where I would be kept hidden by the fence. I basically threw Mocha over on myself, and we were both panting, but I tried to keep quiet as I heard footsteps coming by. The guy had finished the trail and was now in the neighborhood. He stopped running and I heard him panting. I hear him mutter as he was out of breath and kept saying, "What the hell?" I was holding Mocha, scratching her so she wouldn't bark or growl. About 5 minutes later, I heard footsteps retreating away and slowly fading. I waited in 10 minutes in complete silence to be sure he wasn't close by when I peeked my head around the fence, and it was all alone now. I get Mocha and went to the opposite direction from where I heard the guy go. Even though I was tired, I tried to jog just so that I could go home sooner. I kept looking around me. I was very paranoid of that guy. He could be anywhere. I made it back home with no problem, and I've got to thank Mocha for pretty much telling me that someone was behind me and stalking us. I don't know how long he was following us for, or what he was planning to do. I just hope he didn't get a clear glimpse of my face, because I certainly don't want to run into him again. My family were driving on the rural main road of Poland. We're Polish. And next to our car was this truck delivering large concrete pipes. We drove next to this truck for perhaps an hour, maybe 2. I was a teenager and not really paying attention. My dad figures we stop at the next gas station for a quick toilet break. As I exit the car, a pair of bikes drive past the gas station. I noticed this because they were loud as hell. So we do our P's and stuff and get back on the road. About a mile or so down the road, there's been an accident. Turns out the bikes had caught up with the truck, and as they were about to drive past it, the large concrete pipes fell off the truck and smushed the bikers. Maybe they weren't fastened properly, or the truck swerved. I'm not entirely sure, but there were dead bodies, and blood was everywhere. I still have a hard time thinking what could have happened had we have not stopped for that break. A long time ago, in the mid-1970s when I was about 17, I was at the mall arcade just horsing around playing games and riding on the bumper cars. The man was 2 cities away from where I lived, in the suburbs of a major metropolitan area. I knew lots of kids who hung out there, but since we all lived in a distance from this particular mall, we weren't friends away from the arcade. I only knew people there by the first name, and maybe what city they lived in. More commonly, we each knew which kid was the best at which video game. I remember talking to a man outside the arcade who used to ask me very general questions like, did you run out of quarters? Shouldn't you be home studying? I was wearing a t-shirt with my first name on it, but he never called me by my name. He was an adult. I thought he might even be a cop, but as I wasn't doing anything wrong, that part didn't worry me. My mum had dropped me off there, and she picked me up later to bring me home, so I really doubt that he followed me. In fact, I forgot all about him within an hour. About a week later, that man phoned me. Now that scared the living crap out of me. Back when we only had landlines, and I'm 100% certain I didn't give it out to him. I don't remember ever telling this man my surname, and if I had, my surname was different from my mother's, whose name was on the phone bill and in the phone book. I was at home alone when he called. The man was nice, but the situation was so off I was panic-stricken. He said he wanted to make sure I was okay. I asked him how he got my phone number. He just replied, it wasn't difficult, and then the line cut. Once my friends and I were driving back from the nearest decent-sized city to our crappy little hometown in rural Tennessee. Now, I had an older car, but it was in fairly good shape. No real issues aside from some carburetor problems occasionally. There were probably 4 or 5 of us in this car. One of my friends had recently read some novel where a character says, well, Jesus, Buddha, and a bag of chips. Being wise-ass teenagers, we thought this was hilarious for some reason, and we kept coming up with various combinations of blasphemous words in the same vein as the original. After a few minutes of this, suddenly all the lights in the car cut off, inside and out. Nothing else was affected, just the lights. Then just as suddenly they came back on. Obviously we chalked that up to chance. I'd never had that happen in my car before, but it's not something that can't be reasonably explained. After a few minutes of nervous laughter, the blasphemy resumed. Again, the lights shut off. Now I was worried. I thought something was really wrong with the car. My friends accused me of turning the lights off. I hadn't, and convinced them of it. And again, the lights came back. I am currently an atheist, and at the time I was a pretty cynical Christian, and I didn't put much faith in the thought that our banter was pissing off God. So was he sending a message? But still, sometimes you don't tempt faith, right? Well, you aren't me then. Much to the dismay of my friends, I decided to give it one more try. I don't remember the exact phrase, but let's assume it wasn't something you'd say to your grandmother. No sooner had the last syllable rolled off my tongue, the lights cut off for good. This time for long enough to force me to pull over and turn off the car. We sat silently, pondering what had just happened. One of my more religious friends said a little prayer in the back seat, and I kept my cynical mouth shut this time. Eventually I started the car again, and the lights came on like normal, and we rode the rest of the way home in silence. I've never had a problem with anything electrical in that car after that night. The battery even lasted a few more years until I sold it. This happened over 10 years ago, when I was in my early 20s, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. I've only shared this story with my family and a few friends, and it happened when I was living in Japan, so it was pretty normal to see people doing the whole cosplay thing, and I'd see people dressed up in characters and dressed differently, but this was something else. I was out with a friend one night having a few drinks, just the usual dinner and booze at an izakaya lounge. Back then, it was pretty normal for me to either walk home or taxi home after midnight, since the train stopped operating at half midnight to 1 a.m. This was the case for many people that enjoyed the nightlife. It would often be pretty busy in the streets around that time. This particular night, my friend wanted to go clubbing with some of our other friends, but I had a pretty early morning start, so decided to walk home. I lived about a 25-minute walk away from the area we were drinking at. I often took a few shortcuts through some alleyways to get home quicker. As I turned the corner in one alleyway, I was face to face with a guy wearing a clown face paint, but more like the Joker. As I mentioned, it was pretty normal for me to see people with cosplay and dressed differently, so I walked past him with a smile and kept walking. As I passed him, I noticed he had some blood on his clothes, which made me feel a little uncomfortable, but I kept walking. That's when I realized he started following me. I even made some unorthodox turns in different streets to try and get away, and I walked faster, but he kept following. I turned around and asked him if he was okay and if he needed help. That's when he put a big smile on his face, started giggling, and pulled out a kitchen knife. I got freaked out, so immediately turned around and started running away from him. He then burst out in a screaming laugh and started skipping towards me. As I started running fast, he too then started running fast. As I was running away from him, I could still hear him giggling and running towards me. I was running for about 3 minutes when I noticed a small construction site with garbage on the side of it. I saw one of those metal rods used in construction, and I quickly picked it up, turned around and yelled at him. We both came to a complete stop. He saw me with the metal rod and stopped running. I yelled at him and swung the metal rod once and told him that if he stepped closer, I'd hit him. With that, he stopped, and I began walking backwards to make sure I wasn't being followed. After about a block of doing so, he was just standing there, and I turned and began running home. I'll never know what he was trying to do, just scare me, or if it was an actual psychopath trying to kill me. Either way, it was one of the scariest things in my life that has ever happened to me. Near where I live, but far out in the sticks, there's a glorified gravel path in the woods called Rube Hill. It runs maybe 3 miles long and only half mile of it is paved. On the south end is the pavement, with a few old but otherwise normal houses dotting it. Deceptively average at that point. Then the houses end, the pavement ends, and the gravel road shoots up a steep hill. It's not taken care of at all. The gravel is piled up in potholes and berms, so unless you're driving a nice off-road vehicle, you want to take it easy. So since you need to drive slowly, you get a nice, clear view of the handmade signs nailed to the trees with messages like, "No trespassing," "We are watching you," or simply a little angry face scrawled in Sharpie. At the top of the hill, the road winds lazily for a little under a mile before driving back down the other side of the hill. The gravel is in equal crappy condition on this side, and after you reach the bottom of the hill, the road cuts straightish for about a mile through cornfields before intersecting with another road. The reason I am so familiar with the layout is that I have often taken friends on late-night drives to this road to scare the crap out of them. Never an elaborate prank. I just drive slowly and play creepy music and get them amped up and paranoid. I always make sure to talk about the meth heads and their labs out there too, and how the sheriffs try to avoid going there because it's dangerous. I figured it was bullshit, just stories, but I think now there are elements of truth in some of the rumors. I was with my friend Aaron one night. and we decided to go on a late night drive to Rube Hill to freak ourselves out. So we took off, drove down the various country highways and back roads, and turned onto it. I made sure to play extra creepy music since me and Aaron had made the trip before. It honestly is creepier by far, but I still enjoyed the long drives and scaring my friend. Of course, it mostly went by uneventfully, and we almost were completely across the hill and about to descend the other side when Aaron freaked out. I checked my mirrors to see what was concerning him, when I see truck headlights down the road. They seemed to be back where the road first topped the hill. The truck made it under the only street light on the top of the hill, with a really dim orange glow. As I could see, it was kicking up a ton of dirt and was speeding towards us. I paused the music, and sure enough, with the windows down, I could hear the gravel crunching and flying like a vehicle was speeding. Keep in mind, I've driven this road dozens of times, both during the day and at night, and had never encountered another vehicle. So having a truck, speeding, to seemingly catch up with us at midnight, on a lousy road with rumoured meth heads, was pretty jarring. Usually I didn't relinquish my brakes driving down that hill, but this time I didn't touch them. The next day I'm hanging out with a friend, Chris. Chris and I are lounging around playing video games talking about quantum physics, which is Chris's favourite thing, and Chipotle, my favourite thing. I, of course, told him all about Aaron and myself getting chased the previous night, and I kind of hammed it up, and made it come across as a little more harrowing than it really was. But now Chris wanted to go by the road, so we waited until late that night, at least 2 in the morning, and went over to Rube Hill. This time, I wasn't playing any creepy music, as I wanted to be alert. It was all going quite normally, just as usual, when I slammed on my brakes, threw the car into park and said, you see that too, right? I looked at Chris. He was just as confused as me, and he nodded. My headlights were clearly illuminating a thick metal cable stretching across the road. On the right, it was wrapped around a tree, what I guess is roughly head height for a standing adult, and it was pulled tight across the road and anchored to a fence post at roughly chest height. I had no idea what to make of it or how to react. When I heard gravel being thrown by tires, I checked my mirrors, and sure enough, truck headlights were tearing down the road from behind us. I started freaking out. My breathing and heart rate were out of control, and I began sweating. Chris swore under his breath quietly. I threw it into drive, pulled out as fast as I could, and my low-sitting car slid under the cable with a loud metal-on-metal scraping noise. I cringed as I heard the scrape, but I wasn't about to sit there and get deliveranced. So again I flew down the hill, and this was the creepy cherry on the sundae for me personally, because Chris didn't see it. As we left the tree line and entered the cornfields, I glanced to my right, past Chris, and briefly caught a glimpse of someone standing about 3 or 4 feet back in the corn. I just felt my stomach scrunch up and floored the accelerator. I glanced in my rearview mirror and could see a man standing in the road behind us, illuminated by the moon and my taillights. He had a long object slung over his shoulder. I couldn't tell if it was a cane or perhaps a rifle, but I didn't stay to find out. Before I could even tell Chris about it, we were around the bend and out of sight. I haven't been back to that road since. This happened to me at a major train station when I was visiting my long-distance boyfriend. I was 18 at the time. Some guy got on my train and kept glancing at me every now and then. I didn't think anything of it, as I figured it was just in his line of vision. We got off at the same stop, and he let me get off before him. Again, I thought nothing of it. I went to one of the boards to look for my next train, and noticed him next to me, and was like, okay, maybe he's just looking. I went to stand at the top of the escalator before going down to my platform, as I didn't like the loud noises of trains. I noticed he stood a few feet away from me, which started to weird me out. The chances of him being on that very first train and then getting the second train to a completely different place was slim. So I decided to go down the platform to see if he followed me, and he did. By this point, he knew that I knew he was following me, as he had the creepiest smirk on his face, as if he could see me from the corner of his eye, as I realized he was following me. I walked down to the other side of the platform and he followed still. The train arrived and he started to get on the same door as me. I turned away and I was about to get on and asked the guy working at the station if I could borrow his phone to let my dad know to pick me up an hour later, as I would be getting the later train. Screw that. I had visions of this guy throwing acid in my face or something horrible, because people around here do that. So glad I didn't get that train. Creep. This takes place a few years ago, when I was 16 to 17 years old. I am a 22-year-old female now, and used to work at a well-known fast food restaurant. I typically had to work the closing shift, since I had school earlier in the day, so by the time I got home, it was around 11:30 p.m. I had my own car at this time, and when I got off work, I used to sit in my car, recline the driver's seat back, and listen to music and just chill out. I used to do this because I have helicopter parents, so this was the only real alone time I got without being hovered around. Well, one night, I was exhausted. I got stuck with the slow closers, so I got home a little later than normal. I started up my normal routine of sitting in my car, but instead of listening to music and scrolling through my phone, I leaned back and closed my eyes. I didn't fall asleep or anything. I was just listening to myself breathe while taking in the silence of my own company. I don't remember how long I was laying back with my eyes closed, but suddenly I bolted up and saw my mum with an angry face waving frantically at me. She was gesturing at me to come to her immediately. I sighed and hurried out the car towards her. I would like to add my parents like to drink, so she was pretty inebriated when I approached her. She grabbed me by the shoulders and hissed, "Who is out here with you?" Confused, I shook her off. "No one, Mum. I was sitting in the car by myself before I came in." I remember feeling a little annoyed, because I thought I was going to get in trouble. But her face soon turned from angry to concerned. "What? Someone was out here. They were looking at you through the window. I came out here because I had a funny feeling, and when they saw me, they took off into the neighbor's yard." She was slurring her words together terribly and was visibly shaking. Being the teenager that I was, I just rolled my eyes and took her inside. I just thought she was drunk and overprotective, as she got worried that I wasn't in the house at my normal time. When next morning rolls around, I do my normal school routine, kiss my parents goodbye, and as I'm unlocking my car door, I notice something that stops me dead in my tracks. I felt a cold sweat creep up on me, with a chill sliding down my spine. A forehead and 2 forearm prints were on my driver's side window. I never sat in my car after work again. I think about it from time to time, about what would have happened had my mother not come out to check on me. Were they looking into my car to break into it? Did they notice me completely defenseless and try to scare me? I have no idea. But I'm glad I never found out. The most disturbing thing that's ever happened to me was on a long drive back to college for my last semester before graduation. I am a night person, and I was leaving kind of late for the drive, but was expecting to get in at around midnight. Being that I would be living on my own after school, I was feeling a bit sentimental, as it was the first time I was leaving home for the last time. Home was somewhere else now. So it's sunset, and I'm driving towards the highway, and there's a beautiful low fog in the fields along the road catching the light. So I decide to cut off towards West Virginia. I stop at a diner to get gas and proceed towards the VW line as night falls. This is the last human contact I make for the rest of the drive. I didn't foresee it, but an immense, dense fog dropped over Appalachia that night, slowing my drive considerably. At some point, in the mountains there was scarcely 10 or 15 feet of visibility, but there are some small towns in the roads. It's Friday night, and it begins to feel oddly dead in each town as I pass through. It'd be 9 or 10 p.m., and the local bar would be closed. There were no lights on in any of the houses, and I felt uneasy, but maybe that's just how it is there. I'm making terribly slow progress with the fog and the back roads at night, deer sightings keeping my foot a little light when the fog wasn't too bad. But at some point, I'd have to noose my way through foggy intersections, unsure if I'd find the other side. It was almost impassably dense at times, and the trip would take double the estimated time to drive because of it. I'm often driving around at 25 miles an hour, or worse, trying to be safe, and it's around 1 or 2 a.m., and there's no cell phone service as I get into a large national forest. There's no other traffic around. There's been little all night, so I decide to pull over to pee, leaving the engine on for whatever reason. It'd be a quick stop. I'm not fearless by any means, but I try to not let myself get too jumpy in the woods at night. But as I'm coming around the car undoing my belt, I hear voices maybe 40 or 50 yards into the forest, and then there's scrambling through the dead leaves and brush coming in my direction. It's night. No streetlights or houses, national forest. It's cloudy, foggy and starless on a perfectly moonless night, and I can't see anything off the road beyond the red glow of the taillights. Feeling sufficiently freaked out and not willing to find out more, I bolt back to the driver's side and floor it up the next hill. Happy I had now left the car on anyway. My heart is pounding, and I never find out more about this little scare, and I'm glad for that. A while later, I'm heading up some steep mountains and nearing an old fire watchtower from the World War II days. There's a plaque, roughly, about it being a community morale building, to have been built, even if it doesn't affect the war in any way. I pulled into the overlook to actually pee, because I never got the chance earlier. Now that I'm atop a sizable mountain, I suddenly get cell service, and a string of concerned texts from my mother freaking out, asking if I made it okay. By this time I should have been at my house hours ago, but took a long and unfamiliar way in the dark. Knowing that she wouldn't sleep until I was there, she's like that, I respond that I'm home safe, hoping that would end it. But she immediately calls me and asks where I am, and I can't really ignore her having just texted her. I tell her I'm home and she asks, "In Virginia?" And I say, "Yeah, in my college town," despite being at the top of a mountain in a national forest in West Virginia. She sounds deeply unsettled and says she's been trying to call me repeatedly while I had no service. I ask why, and she said she got a really weird phone call from West Virginia, but way west of where you should have been, which is actually where I was. She said she got this phone call from a gruff young man with a backwards-sounding voice, telling her he needed to speak to me, and swearing at her and saying all these nasty things. She said she heard people in the background screaming and people laughing. She hung up and called me a few times before it went straight to voicemail. She typed the number into Google and saw it was from West Virginia, and knew I was at least passing through a small part of it, and called the number back. A small child answered and swore at her, and then the earlier voice ripped the phone back and started saying my name again and saying that he needed to speak to me. This is especially strange because I'm driving my dad's car and I'm not registered to it, so even if someone saw the plates and thought they could run them, they get his name. I think I even paid with cash at the diner and gas station way back, nearly 5 hours earlier and in another state. I cannot think of anything I could have dropped with my name on it, and I had stepped out of the car briefly earlier during the recent incident. I still had all my cards and ID. it would be an incredibly strange coincidence or an extremely elaborate scare prank. I do my best to reassure my mum I have no idea what that could be about and that it must be some weird coincidence. I tell her I'm at my house and I'm okay despite how troubling I find it all in reality. She gives me a half-hearted okay and we say goodnight. I pull out of the watchtower, pull off, and continue on into Virginia. Never have I been so comforted by the 3 a.m. dregs of late-night parties, students stumbling home at a nearby university town off a highway. I know well from my usual route. I carry on that highway and make it home safely, and things have been completely normal since, but I have never brought it up with my mum again, nor have I had the heart to tell her that I was driving that night, or how late, or the voices in the woods. There's no climax, and no resolution. I'm just trying to forget. I am a 21-year-old female. It was June 2019, and I was doing a closing shift at the McDonald's I worked at in a town in England, although I'm originally from Scotland. We close up at 2 a.m. on weekdays and 3 a.m. on the weekends. It has been a Saturday night shift, so I was finishing and out the building by 3:15 roughly. When this happened, I was living about a 10 to 15 minute walk away from my work in a flat that was mostly taken up by students. I didn't have money to spare to constantly get taxis to get me to and from work, and I had been walking home from night shifts for the past year with no incidents, so of course, didn't think any differently of doing it again tonight. The majority of the walk was fine, and I was about 4 minutes away from the flat when I noticed a guy just standing around near the corner I had to turn to get home. I'm very wary when I see other people, but usually they're drunk, and they mind their own business, or just ask for directions or a homeless person as there are plenty of them in the city. This guy was dressed nice, but casual, looked to be in his mid-20s, was well-groomed with tan skin, and was really smelling strong of aftershave. He obviously was a regular at the gym too, because he looked like he had a muscular figure, and didn't seem to be drunk by the looks of him. I tried to keep my distance, but he approached me and started making really casual conversation, asking me what my name was, complimenting my accent, and asking where I was from. I stupidly engaged with him, but gave him a fake name and made it clear I wasn't up for chit-chat. I should have been firm with my words, but I was way too introverted and shy to speak up. Even my boyfriend complains I talk too quietly sometimes, and I struggle to be direct with people. Throughout the whole conversation, he's always giving me this unsettling smile, and would try to touch my arm or play with my hair, which I made as clear as possible I didn't approve of and didn't like. He would just say something along the lines of, "But you're so pretty," not flattering at all when it's a man who won't take no for an answer. This guy then asks me for a hug, and even though I refused him as politely as possible, he did it anyway. I froze up for a few seconds before I moved away, which thankfully he let me do. He was being extremely creepy at this point, and tried feeling over my sides as he hugged me, which gave me even more alarm bells ringing in my head. I told him I had to leave, and as I walked away I heard him say, "I'll walk you home. Where do you live?" Unfortunately, I had nowhere else to go but home. There was no one else around, and it was too early in the morning. My roommate was also back at his own house, and he went back home every weekend. I had a hold of my keys in my pocket and just hoped once I got to the building, I could find a way in without this guy being able to invite himself in. I refused the walk home, but he followed me anyway, walking about 8 to 10 feet away from me, and I was speeding up at this point, and caught up as I crossed the road. I don't know why, but I decided to go the long way to get to my building, which takes an extra 2 minutes, so not that long. And as I was approaching the flats, I felt this horrible sinking feeling in my chest. The door to the building closes really slowly at first before slamming shut, so I knew even if I walked in he could potentially follow me inside, and that puts me at an even greater risk. By this point he was begging me to be let inside. He said he was extremely thirsty and wanted some water, but I told him my roommate was asleep, a subtle way to try and deter him. by showing him that I wasn't alone in the flat. But of course, that did not seem to faze him remotely. He was trying to be touchy and kept pleading with me to just let me inside, but I kept my ground and said no. As he was talking to me, I managed to use the fob on my door, which is the only way to open it. I was careful enough to slide through. However, he was right at the door, and I didn't want to make him upset, so I apologized and told him no once again. Luckily, he had moved away from the door, as someone wanted to get in the building. The guy entered the flat and asked if everything was okay when he saw me, but I stupidly said that everything was fine. That did give me a chance to move away from the door and let it close once the guy walked through. He either worked or lived here, I wasn't sure. I didn't even look back at the guy. I ran up the stairs to my flat as quickly as I could. I didn't get any sleep that night from that moment and made sure that I always had money aside from a taxi. I think I walked home once between June and October before I moved. Really scary stuff, and I'm glad that I never saw him again. The year was 1983. I was a 21-year-old cute bartender who worked in a happening nightclub. I was driving home late one night at 3 a.m. along I-95 in Connecticut. I was in the middle lane and it was raining terribly. I was almost out of gas but figured I could make it home. Thank goodness I was alert enough to notice a white van drive by me in the slow lane. My radar went on when I noticed the van drive past me and the driver hid his face from my view. The vehicle looked shady and it had a New York license plate. I was very aware of the van, and I noticed during the drive home that the driver had maneuvered his vehicle behind mine and was maintaining a distance. As I got off the exit to get home, I watched my rearview mirror as the white van also exited a distance behind me. I was freaking out because I was almost out of gas and my house was approaching. I didn't want to stop because I knew I was in danger, and I didn't want him to know where I lived. I drove past my house and decided to take a right-hand turn to see if he would follow. Sure enough, I could see the van's headlights make the same right turn. I drove past the local convenience store, hoping that a police officer would be parked there. The area was dark and deserted. I chose to drive to the local police station, which was about 7 miles away. I remember the terror I felt during the long drive. It was 3:30 a.m., pouring with rain. My gas tank is on empty, and the town was deserted and cell phones hadn't been invented. This white van followed me through several neighborhoods. I took a right-hand turn onto the road where the police station was at, and he continued to follow me. I parked my car in front of the police station and ran inside. I noticed the white van speed away. I remember that when I ran up to the policeman to tell him what happened, I was paralyzed and couldn't speak. I think it was the only time in my life where I was paralyzed and couldn't talk from the terror. So, that's the happy ending. I made it to the police station. My car didn't run out of gas. Perhaps the lesson is this story is preparedness. Always be aware of what's going on around you, and make sure you have enough gas and cell phone power when driving, especially at night. When I was a little kid between 4 and 5, I loved to run ahead of my mother when we were out. She would say the typical line that all mothers do, "Honey, please stop running ahead of me, I could lose sight of you." I, being the age I was, shrugged it off and thought it was great fun to get attention this way. Well, one afternoon my mother decided we would be going to the mall on a Sunday when the crowd wasn't so huge. Naturally, I began with the running ahead game, and she was not pleased. Now, you know those side hallways that are akin to service entrances between storefronts? Sometimes they even have bathrooms. My mother was following me, watching me run, when a hand reached out from one of those side entrances towards me. She yelled my name and I jumped back, looked at the hands, and once she caught up to me, not a single person was anywhere near the hall. I don't remember this instance all too well, but I do remember I wasn't allowed in big shopping malls until the age of 9 or 10. So props to my mum for dealing with the crazy butt and the weird hand person. Thanks but no thanks from little me. This is a story that I've wanted to share for a while. I'm 28 now, but this took place when I was 22. I'm 5'3" and had a really young-looking face that had me being mistaken for a 16-year-old often. It was December. My mother volunteered for the Feed the Children program. It's a charity that works to help poor families get food and presents for Christmas. I thought it would be fun, since I was a huge fan of Christmas and wanted to help out. So my mother signed me up. We both were so festive with our Christmas shirts and our silly reindeer headbands. For the morning routine, my mother did the hosting and greeted the families, while I was at the front desk having the families sign the application to list how many were in their household and such. And then, I would send them on their way to get their food and presents. Everything was going smoothly, and it was great to be hanging out with my fellow volunteers. By the time lunchtime was over, my mother and I had to switch the positions, so I took over as the host to welcome the guests. But this time, the crowds already slowed down, and I only got to greet a couple of families that came through the door. By then, most of the families already left, with only a handful still inside to gather the remaining food. Then I noticed a man walking over to me. He was tall, slim, Hispanic-looking with dark hair. He went over and told me he had some stuff from the event that he needed help to get into his car. He asked if I could help him. I was already feeling uncomfortable by him and his questions threw me off. I politely told him that I was unable to help because I needed to stay to greet the last of the families. I suggested that he could get some help from the army men that were also volunteering to help him take stuff to the car. They usually help people take their stuff. I would think it would end there, but the man insisted and asked me to take stuff to the car. I again told him I couldn't and just to ask the men for help. He seemed irritated by my reply and just walked away. I was so creeped out by it that I went over to tell my mother about what happened. She seemed also creeped out. She told me to just wait by the front desk, as she was finishing off her job. Luckily, it didn't take long, and we left soon after. Luckily, I didn't see him again. It still creeps me out, especially when he asked me repeatedly about helping to take stuff to his car. It was like he insisted on only I do it. There was a feeling that he may have thought I was younger. If so, why would he even ask me out of all the helpers here? I didn't see him go to anyone else. I've heard of stories of people offering their help like this, and then being hit over the head, forced into the vehicle, and never been seen again. Who knows what his true intentions were? Did I avoid a truly disturbing situation? I lived in the Colorado Rockies for a few years, and for fun would spend hours driving up and down old dirt logging roads. Sometimes, the roads would be wide enough to just accommodate my VW Bug, and most of the time I'd have to drive 20 miles an hour or less, navigating gigantic rocks and potholes, hoping to not get stuck or fall off the steep slopes to the sides. One day, towards the end of the afternoon, it was getting a bit overcast and I could tell a thunderstorm was approaching, so I decided to find the main road and head back via a small town called Mortis. If you know anything about this town and its history, it's way up there in altitude and back in the day, basically consisted of 100 or so recluses and a post office. Lots of odd people up there, and you didn't exactly feel welcome passing through. It was almost as if you were watching people from their cabin windows. So anyway, I pull out of the logging road into a clearing probably 50 yards in diameter and surrounded by tall pine and aspen trees. To the other side is the Forest Service road that leads back down to civilization. In the middle of the clearing is an old, beat-up pickup truck with a shell on it that has a bunch of compartments along the sides. The doors to the compartments are all propped open, but nobody is around as far as I can tell. I drive a bit closer and see that there are maybe 10 dogs, like just a bit older than puppies, running around the truck. They're mutts, tall and skinny as hell, and stupidity gets the better of me, and I get out of my car to take a peek. The dogs come running up to me, so I bend down and pet one, and it starts off friendly enough. Soon enough, most of them are there. Some of them are playing tug-of-war with an old piece of duct tape. I couldn't tell if they were hungry, perhaps abandoned, playing or something, so I yell, "Hello?" No answer. I yell again, about a minute or so later, and at that moment I hear the very distinct impression that I'm being watched from the perimeter of the clearing. By then the dogs had surrounded me. A few are nipping at my hands and legs, so I start walking back to the car and one jumps at my hand. I'm trying to keep calm, knowing better than to run. But by the time I get back to the car, some of the dogs are growling, and a few more are trying to jump on me. The storm is coming in now. The wind is blowing, and a light rain starts. I get into my car and have to push one of the dogs out as I slam it shut. They're all at the door now, looking menacing, teeth bared, and I slowly drive out of there as the thunderstorm breaks full out. Looking in the rearview mirror, I don't see anyone around. A few miles down the road I reach Mortisuma and consider stopping to report what I saw, but decided to get the hell out of there as fast as possible instead. This happened when I was about 7 or 8. I don't remember all the details, but I do remember some really messed up stuff. When I was a kid, I lived in a pretty sketchy neighborhood. We lived in those long apartments, the ones that are attached at the sides rather than stacked on top of each other. The front of the apartments faced the main road, and there was a little side street to access the parking and backyard of the apartments. Behind the apartments was a massive field. It was super overgrown, so much that it was almost a little forest, and my friends and I used to go back there to build hobbit holes in the grass. My mum hated it when we went out there, because there were some rough people that lived in the neighborhood, and she didn't like a group of 7-year-olds playing out there, where people also shot up heroin. One day I was out in the woods by myself, just exploring and pretending to be Indiana Jones. That's when I saw something. I was coming out of the tall grass, and I could see a little back alley in between the parking/houses and the woods, and I saw a deer lying in the grass. I thought it was just sleeping, so I crept up on it to try and scare it. I know, not cool, and when I got there I knew something was off. The deer was still, and smelled horrible. I couldn't see its face, as if its back were facing me. But when I got up to it I nearly had a heart attack, when I saw that its entire stomach was ripped open and all of the insides were spewed on the ground. I wasn't a smart kid, but I knew that this was messed up. When I turned to run back home to tell my mum, I saw a second deer nailed to the tree next to the first. I don't know how I didn't notice this before, but its 2 front hooves were nailed above its head to the tree. Its stomach was cut open and the ribs had been broken to expose the gaping hole. As I stood there staring at it, a car drove past on the little alley. I remember it was a white car with tinted windows and was driving really slowly. I mean, everyone drove slowly on this alley because it was a residential street, but these people were barely even moving. I couldn't see inside, but I got the sinking feeling that they were just watching me. Obviously, I can't be certain that they were the people who mutilated the deer, but I'm 99% sure that it was. Once they were gone, I booked at home and told my mum the whole thing. She told me not to go to the field anymore. Great. And I happily agreed. I didn't particularly enjoy seeing a deer's insides, and I would have loved to just forget about the whole thing. For the next month or so, I saw that car everywhere. It would drive up the main road while I was playing in the front yard. It would drive down the back alley when I would be in the front yard, and I would even remember seeing it at the grocery store when my mum and I went shopping. That could have been another tinted window white car, but they were definitely stalking the house. It was always the white car, always the tinted windows, and always driving way too slowly to be normal. I told my mum about it, but she chalked it up to just being a neighbor down the road. One day my mum was out mowing the front lawn. Because of the way the apartments were set up, she had to push the lawnmower around all of the apartments to get to our backyard. Being the helpful little kid I was going to meet my mum out back to open the gate for her so she could put the lawnmower in the little shed. As I'm walking out to the gate, I see the car come along the back alley. Normally the car goes slow. As soon as it turned the corner, however, the driver stepped on the gas and zoomed up to me. The back door closest to me was open, and someone got out and started running towards me. I don't remember what he looked like, or even if it was a he. I just remember hauling ass back into the house and pissing myself the whole time. After that, my dad yelled at me for peeing, and neither he or my mum believed me about the guy in the car. I never saw him again after that, and we moved a few months later. My parents still think I made the whole thing up, even though they knew how sketchy the neighborhood was. And I don't remember anyone going missing around that time in my town, and I didn't find anything when I googled it. But it was really messed up, and I have no idea who the people in the car were, why they mutilated the deer, or what they had planned for me. About a month ago, when summer was just at its end, my friend Rose and I decided to go for a drive up to the mountains. I grew up nearly out of city limits and drove to mountain roads often. Rose is a newer friend in my life and had only been up in the mountains a few times. I was eager to show her how cool it was at night, especially when you're heading back to town, and you can see all of the city lights as you're leaving the foothills. I love listening to creepy videos and watching scary movies, which may have been a big help for Rose and I on this particular night. We headed up in my van, a dependable '03 Toyota who had made the journey with me dozens of times before. There's a part where the pavement ends, and the gravel road takes you deeper into the mountain. Just beside this stretch of asphalt to gravel is a stretch of dirt that people used to park their cars, trucks, and trailers on. Rose and I drove by and noted that the pullout was empty, as was normal for this time of night. It was 10 p.m, the sun had set, and the lights with timers had all turned on in town. I'd never seen any of the lights up the mountain though. Almost every farming field on the mountain is fenced off with a locked gate that will say private property, normally with bullet holes in the metal to show that the owners are armed and generally pissed off at idiots that try to break into their fields. Every field in the mountains is watered with a center pivot irrigation system. Those are the long, repeatedly arched systems with metal frames and wheels that are commonly seen all over the United States agricultural districts. I'd seen a few irrigational systems in town that had lights with timers on them, so at first I wasn't too surprised when I saw one light in a field. We'd only gone a quarter of a mile in by now, but then I remembered that not only had the light not been there before, it was in the wrong place. Oh crap, I sighed, which was probably not what Rose wanted to hear in the middle of her first nighttime mountain excursion. "What's up?" Rose asked. Well, I know farmers are harvesting now, so I guess a light in a field makes sense, but at the same time I've never seen one like that before. I say that, gesturing off to our right, where there is a very random amber light at the edge of a field. It's dark enough that I can't see fences or any of the big boulders around it, but I was familiar enough with the mountain to know that it was the edge of the property. I started to tap on the wheel anxiously, as I was filled with mixed emotions. I was eager to keep going, because the mountains were going to be beautiful in the half moon, and Rose had never seen them at night before. At the same time, my brain told me that if I'm going to listen to a few dozen hours of horror stories per month, I'd at least better get some meaning out of them. Hell, I'm sorry, Rose, I'd keep going if those were tractor headlights, but I've never seen just one light right there, especially in that field. I've never even seen it farmed, so it wouldn't even make sense to waste money or energy lighting it. Rose is amazed and didn't mind that we were turning around only a quarter of a mile in. We turn and head back towards the asphalt. I had no idea why, but I felt like there was a clock that suddenly started ticking. Hey Rose, could you please hold the handle? I'm gonna go fast enough that you might want something to hold onto. I promise we're safe. Rose silently clutched onto the handle above the passenger side of the car, and I went faster, and I felt that sense that it was time to hurry up, so I did. I zoomed back towards the asphalt, as fast as I dared, my sense of trepidation only intensifying when we reached the truck park zone. There was a white truck and a flatbed trailer that had not been there less than 10 minutes before. 5, maybe 6 guys were around the truck that had its headlights on. One guy was in a UTV, backing it off a flatbed trailer, so fast I thought he was going to crash it into one of his friends. I raced by and someone ran behind the car. I turned onto the road that would lead to the main road. Rose? I asked while inching my way to 70. Were those people there when we drove by earlier? I just want to make sure I'm not crazy. Nope, she said. I sighed, copying her tone. Even as I jumped to 75 and glanced in my rearview mirror, as far as I could tell we weren't being followed, but we had 8 miles of straight flat road with no cover before we actually managed to hit civilization. Did they seem like they were in a hurry to you? There was no other traffic, so we didn't have to slow down for anyone, which helped us both remain as calm as possible. Huh, just a bit, she laughed nervously, looking over her shoulder to check for any cars as well. Thankfully nobody came. We drove to a crowded restaurant and sat in the car while we calmed down. We tried to think of a reason why those guys had shown up there so abruptly in the middle of the night. Maybe they were friends going camping. Who knows? But all the land in the mountain is private property, so no one camps there. Maybe it's best we didn't figure it out. This story happened when my best friend and I were 15. We had to take an important exam at the end of the year, and were attending some private tuition in order to prepare. Because of this, we could only hang out on Saturdays and after 5. We were at the mall, and after a bit of window shopping, she asked me to come outside to the park so she could smoke a cigarette. She took it from her mum, but I didn't smoke. I never liked it. But I accepted anyway, as I was used to her doing so. So we were in the mall's park, walking while she was smoking that damn cigarette. It was like 6 p.m, but it was already dark outside, as this happened to be in winter. Let me describe the location. There was a large park full of trees and big rectangular-shaped bushes. On the side aisle there were some restaurants, a full 10-meter gap, and an exit to a dark street and the parking lot. Another big space and a place for skating. We thought we were 100% safe as we were walking on the mall's property. We arrived near that strange exit when a 5'9" man approaches us and asks for a cigarette. My friend tells him she doesn't have any other cigarettes because she got it from someone else too. He seemed to be in his late 40s, was unshaved and wearing a red hoodie which almost covered his eyes. I tell him we have to go, and he replies with some incoherent babbles. We knew something was off, so we took a few steps back. "Why are you scared? I won't do anything," he said as he was approaching us. "Don't worry, I've met a lot of girls like you," he said, then started to mumble more incoherent babbles. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know if he had a weapon, and behind us was a large bush. In front of us was him. If we'd have chosen to run in different directions, he would have been able to catch at least one of us and probably take her with him. There weren't many people out, but the ones who were passing by didn't seem to notice nor care about our terrified looks or what was going on around them. My friend starts to repeat that she was sorry, but she couldn't help him, and I think that one of the passerbys heard her. Fortunately, a tall man of about 6'3", who looked a lot younger and stronger than the creep, stopped and asked him why he was bothering us, but wasn't giving any response. My friend took the stance, crushed her cigarette with her foot as quickly as possible and began running. I, as a complete idiot, remained frozen for a few more seconds and looked into our saviour's eyes and then started sprinting. The man then looked me in the eyes and just said, "Fly, you fools," while I started to depart. We didn't stop running until we were sure that they couldn't see us anymore. Both of them left, and we got back to the mall safely and never told anyone about the encounter. Creep from the mall, let's not meet again. This happened at the end of January 2019. I live near a small city in Germany, and I just finished my 3.5-year apprenticeship as an electrician. We were at the official ceremony in that city, and then went into a pub after to continue celebrating. My colleagues and me were drinking until 4 a.m. before I made my way home. I left the keys to my home in my car, so that on my way home, I wanted to stop by my car to grab them. I started walking from the pub and noticed that 2 people were following me. I recognized their faces from the pub before, but I thought they maybe just needed to go the same way. It's a safe city, and I'm 6'5" and had never really had any problems with anyone from here. After another few hundred meters, I was pretty sure they were following me, and this was proven when the shortest began to shout and were basically next to me at this point. "Hey, who are you? Where are you going?" "I'm calling a taxi and gonna go home." "Where is that home?" "What are you doing here? We can wait for the taxi with you." "Sorry, I'm pretty tired and just want to go home. I don't really know you, so it doesn't really make sense for you to wait around with me." After that, the dude stopped at the crossing and I kept on walking, just for drunk guy number 1 to run after me, grab my collar, raise his fist and ask me something like, "What exactly is your plan for life? You tell me now exactly what you have planned in your life. I can take you to make a lot out of your life. We'll take you with us to Station 4 and they can show you how you can live your life." They showed me too. Even though I'm tall, I've never been into a fight and didn't really want to try on 2 guys at once for my first time. So basically started telling him my plans for life without details, trying to talk my way out of this situation. To my relief, the other drunk guy started telling drunk guy 1 that I have a plan for life and that we don't have to worry about him until the first guy gets loose of me and hugged me and wouldn't let go for about 20 minutes. I had 110, the German 911, typed in my phone but didn't really manage to call them. At the end, I managed to get home safely without much damage, and I guess it was just some misled soul that in his drunken mind thought he would help someone, but I'm pretty sure the encounter could have gone down a different path very quickly. This story is my dad's. About 17 years ago, my dad was a bait fisher hauler who made runs from Arkansas to the Northeast and Midwest. At one point, he was in Ohio. Traffic came to a dead halt. Accident right up ahead of him. A car had been barreling down the highway and drove right under a truck and hit the dot bar. Dad noticed the smoke, figured it meant a fire was starting up, so he jumped out and ran up the back of the truck, where a bunch of other truckers and some drivers were. An engine fire was indeed starting, and there were 2 kids in the back seat of the car, real disoriented from the impact. The back passenger window was too small in the car for them to smash open to get the kids out, so they had to go through the front passenger window. Dad was the only one with a small enough frame of the group willing to climb in, so he did. Unfortunately, the driver was too stupid and hadn't been wearing a seatbelt. He'd been decapitated, and his body was laying over the passenger seat. So my dad had to climb over him between the front seat and pull 2 kids out who were basically dead weight out. He managed to do so. The car was mostly engulfed in flames about 15 minutes later. They handed the kids off to an elderly couple who took them back to their car and cleaned the blood off them and gave them some sandwiches they'd packed. State troopers got there a while later, took statements, and all of that from everyone. The state boys went back and checked on the kids. They were mostly fine, a little bit shaken up. The oldest one was a little girl, and Dad had a chuckle at one point when the little girl said, "Mama's gonna be mad at Daddy this time." Made him wonder what other bonehead moves the dude had done in the past. I remember when Dad came home after that run. He had a styrofoam ice chest with him, and his clothes were in ice water. Those clothes had been absolutely drenched in blood. Luckily, it all came out in the wash, which was good, because they were his favorite jeans. At the time of this story, I was around 13. I used to take horseback riding lessons at the center and had to travel pretty far from home to get there. Since there's no public transport where I live, they provided a shuttle to collect us at certain locations and hours. The nearest shuttle stop to my city was a city exit. Basically, this city exit was a huge traffic roundabout leading to the city ring, some huge avenues with sports centers, and the entrance of a park and forest, where the riding stables were, and also known for prostitutes. If I had children, I surely would not let them go there alone, but 14-year-old me decided that that would be the perfect spot to wait for a shuttle. I went there to take the 5:15 shuttle, arrived 30 minutes early just to be sure, and sat on a bench near one of the sports centers. It was the first time I had to take it. You had to wave to the driver in order for him to stop, but I had no idea what the shuttle even looked like. There was no logo or anything printed on the minibus, just white and blue. So I waited and waited until 4:15, and there was no shuttle. 20 minutes passed, no shuttle, and I began to panic a bit. What if I didn't see it? At this point, I was standing up. Maybe the driver would stop if he saw a young girl in riding clothes. Still nothing. It was starting to get dark. Then I noticed a car, very old one, so quite noticeable, parked a bit further up the road, with a guy in it. I thought to myself that maybe he was waiting for someone in the sports center. I was, and still am, very anxious, so having a man sitting in a car with a nice view on me waiting stressed the hell out of me. Another 20 minutes go by, and bingo, a crowd of people got out the sports center, and one of them got into the car. I was relieved, or so I thought. But they didn't move. I started to panic. Now there were two guys in a car and they were watching me. In my stupid teen mind, I started to hope even more that the 6:15 shuttle would show up. It was really dark now and I really couldn't read the signs on the shuttles any longer. Scared, I decided at 6:20 it was time for me to go home. I began walking, and at that moment I moved from my spot. The guys started up their car, and I tried to stay as calm as possible and not run, because I thought that if I started running or screamed for help, they would get out their car and take me. I tried to contact my mum, but she didn't respond, and of course, my phone battery died shortly after. To get back home from there, I had to walk down one long road for approximately 10 minutes, and then turn on my street. My initial plan was to kind of disappear into the crowd once I could reach the more busy area. But that night there was nobody in the streets, and I couldn't deviate from that road because I didn't know the place very well and didn't have a map. The car was clearly following me, very slowly and with its lights on max intensity. In my city, everyone drives crazy fast and never at the maximum lights because of street lighting, so it was very suspicious. 5 minutes before arriving home, the car was still behind me. It was at this moment I realized I couldn't just head straight home, because they'd know where I live. So I got this other idea, turn on a street they couldn't turn on. I finally was in my neighborhood, a place I knew like the back of my hand, so I turned on a small one-way road and ran like I never had before. I often read that people run and don't look behind them, but I did. I saw their car had stopped at the turn. They couldn't drive there because other cars were passing in the street. It was game over. I have no idea what could have happened if I'd have led them to my place, and I'm really glad they didn't get out their car. I just hope to never meet them again. I was 17 years old and lived in a very small rural community of Central California. It was late spring of 1996. My best friend and I were bored and decided to take a drive, something we did frequently. Bear in mind that where I lived was basically surrounded on one side by mountains and the other by over 80 miles of flat, sandy valley. It was around 11 p.m. and we had been driving out towards the valley on a dirt road for about an hour, descending down into the valley from the hills. I spot a glimmer of reddish-orange light. We of course drive another 20 minutes towards the glimmer and come upon it. Coals. The glimmer was embers or coals of a fire. Where we were there was nothing, and I mean nothing, no bushes, no trees, no hills, nothing for at least 10 miles in either direction. Flat. We shined a handheld spotlight all around and didn't see anybody or anything. We decided the proper thing to do was to turn the truck around and throw dirt on the embers by spinning the truck tires. As my friend backed up the truck, I looked out my rolled down window, and not 5 feet from me was the largest man I've ever seen. Black, shirtless, bald, wearing only denim shorts, at least 6'5", 300 pounds, and staring right at me. I yelled, "Drive!" and without even looking, my buddy tears out of there. When I catch my breath, I explained what I saw. He's still driving to 50 to 60 miles an hour on a dirt back road towards town, which at that speed, we could easily reach town in 30 minutes. Of course, my buddy never saw anyone, and he and I both think I'm losing my mind. Remember, there was nothing outside there beside the coals, no car, no motorcycle, nothing. No way for anyone to be out there other than by foot. I should also mention that heading back to town, there are a large number of dirt roads in, and I'm talking hundreds. Trails, roads, hills. Hell, we were in a 4x4 and could have made our own road if we wanted to. We ended up coming down a rarely used dirt road, and on the last curve before the pavement just outside of town, the same man steps out from behind a tree, looks at us, shakes his finger and head at us as if he was scolding a child. We both saw him this time, and when we looked back he was gone. This is the only story in my life I have no explanation for. First, there is no possible way this person could have just known which way we would have gone back into town, especially with enough time to hide and wait for us. Second, and I know I already said it, but there was no vehicle out in the flats. There just wasn't. To this day, I get the creeps just thinking about it. This happened to me in Paris 4 years ago. It was night. I was alone, and it was my second night being there. This random dude and I exchanged hellos waiting for the metro. He ended up sitting next to me. Started talking more, and I wasn't engaging that much. I was keeping my cool. I ended up getting off at the stop after mine, so he wouldn't know where I was staying, but he followed anyway. So here I am, an American girl, the first time ever in Paris. Luckily it was my second day, and I had used the metro, albeit once, getting off a stop that isn't mine but nearby, in the dark and alone, with a dude following me. I verbally tell him to go away while he says he wants to marry me and is walking right next to me. It's late enough that there weren't that many places open. I can't totally remember how I dodged him initially, but I ended up running into a restaurant after I got him to go away. Probably because I declined his proposal again. The restaurant doors were open and there were a few men sweeping. I ran inside and hid behind a wall for about 5 minutes. I didn't have internet, as I was super cheap, so I pulled up screenshots of a map to help me figure out where I was relatively located while I was inside. I think the workers knew something was up. They walked me down the side alley and pointed me in the direction I needed to go, and I pretty much ran my ass all the way back. The whole reason I was out late is because I wanted to see the Eiffel Tower at night. Oh yeah, and out of nowhere, a 7-year-old kid hit me in the arm and asked me for a cig. I said, no. Then he nodded his head towards this creepy man standing 8 feet away and said, if you don't give me a cig, he'll come over here. So yeah, I gave a 7-year-old a cig. Paris is a strange place. When I was in elementary school, one of the boys a few grades ahead of me was Carl Doob. I was 2 or 3 grades below him, so I didn't have much contact with him outside of recess. In the 4-square line, he often made it a point to stand right behind me and yank on my pigtails as hard as he could, whipping them around under the pretense that I was a horse and he was riding me. He also used to bring knives to school and would sometimes threaten some of the classmates with them when they did something to make him angry. At one point, he actually pulled one on a girl after school out behind school. Why nothing was officially done about it, I don't know. But my school, being very small, was not known for being on top of the disciplinary side of things. There was a number of smaller things, the hair pulling, just the general way he acted, that led to me being uncomfortable whenever he was around. I wasn't alone in this regard. Former classmates have also expressed feeling uneasy in his presence. To my relief, he ended up moving away, and none of us heard anything from or about him for a number of years. That is, of course, until one day he showed up on the local news, having been arrested for the murder of Nicole Cable. He made a fake Facebook profile, lured her out of her house, kidnapped her, duct taped her, and left her in the back of his dad's pickup truck. His intention was to pretend to find her and be the hero. When he went back, he found that she was already dead. He dumped her body in the woods and covered it in sticks. They found her about a week later. I was in school when I read the article and had to go to the nurse's office because I felt so weak and sick. It's very disconcerting to think a murderer used to yank on my hair. A few years ago, I moved to Fort Worth and later took a job in Lubbock. I had a wedding to attend back in Missouri, so I took a load of my stuff to my new apartment and then drove back to Missouri. It was a long drive, and I left the wedding reception at around 6 or 7 and started to drive back because I had my new job in the morning. Between Lubbock and Wichita Falls, there is a 3.5-hour stretch of highway that is mostly ranch country. There are a few really tiny towns sprinkled in, but you can drive the whole 3.5 hours and would never see a car if you do it at the right time. I happened to come through at 3 a.m., so I turn onto the highway, which runs basically straight east-west looking forward to the last leg of the drive and finally being able to sleep. There was no one on the road, and you just have that weird feeling of being alone. There was no reception for me once I left Wichita Falls until I got to Lubbock. So here I am driving through ranch country with no reception and nothing around, and I come to one of the first little tiny towns on the side of the road, and in the middle of the town is a car that seems to be broken down. There's a woman standing there with the hood up and a jack nearby, but not actually being used, and is trying to wave me down. Normally I'd stop and help in situations like this, but I really needed to get back and grab some sleep. Not to mention how the whole thing just felt wrong. As soon as I pass the car, the woman runs to the passenger side and gets in. A man springs out, hiding behind the other side of the car, slams the hood down, jumps in and starts the car, and they begin driving after me. It was all super hurried as soon as I didn't stop. So I did what anyone would do and pumped it to 80 to 90 and hoped there wasn't a cow loose. I could see their headlights on the highway behind me for a long time, but they eventually gave up. We hadn't come to any other town or place to turn off, so they had to have turned around. I was super creeped out. but I think I kind of forgot about it, until I remembered some stories the other day. When I was a little girl, I lived in an apartment complex with my mother. The entire complex consisted of 2 buildings that sat side by side, less than 100 feet apart, with 4 2-bedroom flats, 2 upstairs, 2 down. We lived about 100 yards from the hill, from a major 5-lane road, but you never would have known that due to the thick woods that bordered the complex on 3 sides. The last side was an area cut for power lines that ran next to our driveways, with a graveyard directly beyond it. It would go without saying that this setup was a recipe for many childish shenanigans as well as creepy encounters. On the front side of the complex and along the power line side were thick blackberry brambles. They weren't quite as thick along the power line area, but in the front of the apartment you couldn't stick your arm out without being torn apart by thorns, and it was so thick it was nearly impossible to push through. This information will be relevant later. I was the only young child that lived there full time, and all the neighbors were, to the best of my knowledge, fond of me. I was active in Girl Scouts, so when it was time, I would go around to all the neighbors for orders. When the cookies came in, I'd get my little wagon and deliver them to the neighbors by myself, because my mother knew and trusted them. The day this happened, I had taken my wagon to the other building to deliver cookies. I hadn't meant to stay as long as I had, but my mother's friend's husband had bought some new fish. I was fascinated with their aquarium and had spent about 45 minutes helping them pick out names. And when I began to walk back, dusk had fallen. I had walked about 7 steps off the porch when I got a bad feeling. Now that I'm older, I understand that I've learned to listen to my intuition. I stopped for a second to settle my stomach and I heard a noise. When I looked to the front of the apartment where the blackberries were the most thick, initially I couldn't see anything. I forget exactly what alerted me to his presence, but I think he flicked a lighter or something. It was like he was trying to purposefully alert me of his presence. The second I saw him, I froze. He had shoulder-length, stringy black hair, bad skin, and looked like a skeleton. Knowing what I know now, I imagine he was probably strung out. I realized when he knew I saw him because his face split into a wicked, not at all friendly grin, and then he began tearing his way through the blackberry brambles towards me. I began running towards my house while screaming bloody murder. Even over my screams, I heard his feet slap on the pavement behind me. I got to my Uncle Mike's house, who lived next door, flung his door open to see what the hell was going on, and I began to scream and cry about the man that had chased me out of the woods. But by this point the man had disappeared. Mike hadn't seen him, so initially he thought I let my imagination run away with me. But when they looked at the area I said he'd emerged from, there was a clear area of broken brush and blood from where he'd been cut by the thorns. After they took their machete to cut away the brambles and investigate where he'd come from, they discovered an area he'd been standing in with a small pile of cigarette butts, like he stood there watching me for quite some time. A few weeks later, deeper in the woods, my mother's boyfriend and I discovered a small tent with assorted paraphernalia and very disturbing images. No one mentioned the connection, but I was very mature for my age, and when I thought about it, it disturbed me very much. So, stranger that departed your tent to watch me from the woods, let's not meet again. I was once driving home from a friend's house over winter break a few years ago. It was really late at night, around 2:30 a.m., and I decided to go on the back road to my house because it's a little faster and about 7 less miles than the highway. This particular road I was on after midday traffic isn't a very popular road at all, except for those who live on it. While driving, I took a big turn and noticed a vehicle coming in the opposite direction as one in front of me. Strange, but nothing out of the ordinary. I passed the car going in the opposite direction, and it was a white van. I got behind the car in front of me, which was a truck. As soon as I got behind the truck, the van stopped and quickly turned around. From that point on, for about 2 miles, the truck went really slowly while the van rode my ass the entire way. I was petrified. Why did the van immediately stop going one way and turn around to go behind me, especially that late at night? Both the truck and the van slammed on their brakes when we got to a part of the road without any streetlights, and I managed to barely squeeze through both cars, stopped, and raced home. I was going at 75 miles an hour on a road that had a 30-mile-an-hour limit. I've never been so afraid in all my life. I called the cops and told them the license plate number and description of the truck in front of me. It took me months to be able to go down that road again. Pretty much anyone who lives in New York City is familiar with the free hugs guys. They frequent parks and high tourist areas holding up signs that say free hugs, and often charm tourists. Most of them are very peaceful and friendly. They mean no harm and just want to spread the love. If you want a hug, they give you a hug and send you on your way. If you don't wish to be hugged, they wish you well and go on offering hugs to others. However, about 2 years ago, I had a frightening encounter with one who was far from peaceful. I live in Brooklyn, and I had gone to Union Square to meet my dad who was visiting from upstate. Seeing how I arrived before him, I told him I would meet him on the steps of the park when he arrived. Shortly after I sent my dad the text about my location, I was approached by a free hugs guy who of course was offering me a free hug. Now, being a petite young woman living in a large city, I tend to ignore random men who stop me on the streets to speak with me, and like many women in the city, I have faced a lot of aggressive catcalling, and that has also made me very cautious about such interactions. Plus, I really do not like being hugged by strangers, so I politely decline, and wished him a nice day, thinking he would just move on to the next person. A few moments later, I noticed that he was still staring at me, so I got up and moved. He followed me and asked me why I didn't want a hug from him. I was a bit weirded out as I've never seen any of the free hug guys act so persistent, so I politely explained it was nothing against him, but I just didn't like to be touched by strangers. I thought that would be enough, but I was not rude to him in the least. But even so, I started to leave the park, and he followed, demanding that I hugged him. Having had enough, I said that I did not mind him offering hugs, but the fact that he was following me was starting to creep me out. This caused him to explode and start cussing. He said that if I did not leave the park immediately, he'd punch me in the face. I started running, but he followed, threatening me still. I was looking for the police, but oddly this was the one time that there weren't any NYPD present in the Union Square. Thankfully, I made it into a Starbucks and he didn't follow me inside. I told my dad what happened, and by the time he arrived, Free Hugs Guy was now gone. Ever since that event, I've been very cautious about going to the Union Square Park or any other similar place alone. Thankfully, it seems this particular Free Hugs Guy was arrested last year after he actually did punch a woman in the face. He apparently had a history of becoming aggressive, following women and threatening them. However, it's New York City, so I don't know if he's back out there offering hugs, but threatening to punch people who refuse them. My girlfriend and I took some time out to do some backpacking and traveling the world. We went to some incredible places and met some interesting people. But our most interesting story is most probably this one. As I've said before, we went all over. Myanmar, Bolivia, Mexico, and many places that people said were a bit unsafe in their reputation. However, we are both pretty good at reading people and staying out of trouble, so we never had any major incidents. We were on a fairly tight budget at this point in our journey, as we had recently been in Japan and wanted to chill for a bit before finding some work in Vietnam. We decided to volunteer on a Cambodian island, Koh Rong San Loem. It's a bit of a luxury island full of resorts that we wouldn't normally be able to afford and stay at, so working seemed like a good gig. I worked behind the bar at this resort and my girlfriend worked in the restaurant. In return, we got to sleep in the dorms and had our meals for free. The manager told me that since I was working behind the bar, it was quite likely that I would run into a Scottish/English guy who lived on the island and would likely come see me, and that his name was Dog. It didn't take long for this to take place. A fairly old guy in his late 50s, early 60s came into the bar, rather tall, powerfully built, and accompanied by a massive Rottweiler, which he quickly told me was also called Dog. We had a bit of a laugh, taking the piss out of each other. He was making fun of me for being Scottish, and I was making fun of him by going by the name Dog and being English. Standard British nonsense. I noticed he was always wearing a wife beater, which said Dog's Offshore Bar, and had a picture of his Rottweiler on it. I got to know more about Dog the man. He used to work in construction and offshore, as did I, and we had quite a bit to talk about, and heaps of opportunities to talk, as he usually arrived for his first beer at 7 a.m. and was clearly an alcoholic. But he never struck me as a bad person early, just as a sad, complicated one when you talk to someone who's homeless. Anyone who's ever been to Vietnam, Thailand or Cambodia, pretty much any Southeast Asian country, will understand how rare it is to see a dog that's not some kind of street mutt or tiny pet. Dog's huge dog would stand out even in Europe. Even for a Rottweiler, it was huge. Massively muscular, with a metal chain to give some semblance of control, if it was to kick off. I really liked dogs, so was quite interested in what this huge dog was doing on the island, and always made sure to have some water out for it. It was friendly enough, but never left his owner's side, and seemed to be a working dog. In terms of intensity, it was clearly a guard dog. It turned out the dog was actually a Finnish drug dealer's dog, and that Dog, the person, had bought him. He told me the dog had an attack command that he kept him primed by, using it often on other island dogs. He told me it had killed multiple dogs this way. I didn't believe this at first, but there was an island dog the manager would often leave food out for, and this dog would come near the bar usually when Dog's monster dog wasn't about. But that night, he must have been hungry enough to brave it, and Dog hissed the command, and Rottweiler bounded for the island dog, knocking over chairs and all sorts until he was called off. It was pretty scary. One night, I was sat at the bar talking with Dog about this job I would be taking on soon at a digital marketing company. I was in talks with the CEO at this company, and it was a digital marketing job, which I would work from home or coffee shops, updating and improving websites. He said it sounded made up, and that the company was likely some kind of con to get my bank details. I told him it was a real company, and that I had Googled it. He was really drunk at this point, and the restaurant was now closed, so my girlfriend joined us, and we were all having a beer at the bar. He told my girlfriend how I believed everything I read online, and how I shouldn't do that. He said, people publish all kinds of made-up stuff there, and I asked what he was referring to, and he said, never Google me. So I was like, how could I Google you? Your name's Dog. If I Googled you, all I would see is a picture of an Alsatian. But then I remembered those tops he wore, Dog's Offshore Bar. So I told him, I'm gonna Google you, laughing. He was getting quite annoyed. But at this point, other than owning a weaponized canine, I thought he was pretty harmless. I was wrong. I began reading out loud the interesting things I found out about his bar and related stories. One of the particular interesting ones was about a conviction. The joking and laughing stopped, and I quickly stopped reading out loud. I looked quickly to my girlfriend, and I could see the smile leave her face as she realized we were drinking with a killer. It turned out this guy had murdered his Thai wife and then been briefly imprisoned before paying bail, as you can pay bail for murder in Thailand, and then fleeing the country before trial. He had stabbed her, and his alibi to the police was that he couldn't have killed her because he was screwing a ladyboy on the beach at the time. He told us that he had been framed and that his wife's ex was in the police and he had killed her for moving on. I was nodding along to everything he said and trying my best to show that I agreed with him while making sure the machete I used to open up coconuts for cocktails was within easy reach, should the beast be given a command. He told us about how hard it was being one of the few white guys in Thai prison, how he had to attack guards to get into solitary confinement, and then they beat him up mercilessly. He told us they used to leave shanks in his room and put them in the yard with pedophiles for him to kill. He told us that he had killed before he went to prison, and that he killed while he was inside, but he didn't kill his wife. His wife was a Thai prostitute he met while trafficking women from Thailand to Singapore on his boat, the same one he used to flee Thailand after his arrest and set up his bar, Dogs Offshore Bar, with the tagline, "Dogs welcome, wives must be kept on leashes or under control." We both acted like we believed him and eventually he left. The whole night, however, I was waiting next to the door for him and his dog to come for us. I even propped a bin up against the door so anyone coming would knock it over, and we would maybe have a chance to react. I nearly attacked my friend when he came in. I was so scared. We quickly decided to leave after this, and only saw Dog once more. My girlfriend was opening a can of coconut milk for a curry, and he came by and jokingly asked if she needed a knife, and he patted his back pocket. The guy is known as Mick the Pom, or Mick the Dog if you want to Google this. If you Google Dogs Offshore Bar, you'll see what I did. He was living on a tent on the island with his dog, keeping watch while he slept. I'm not sure if he still lives there now. But Dog, let's not meet again. My girlfriend and I were going on a backpacking trip in NorCal. She had worked that afternoon until 5, so we didn't hit the back roads to the mountains off the highway until just before dark. The route we took was plenty familiar and went through a nice country area. This was our second trip to the same place. Only the first time we came there happened to be during an OHV competition, so the place was really populated. This time it was not, and my girlfriend joked about the movie where a serial killer cleaned out a town and just kind of played shop after killing everyone. Of course, she then fell asleep, leaving me up with our dog alone. The whole drive through the town, and then the farmlands went by without meeting a single person. When we finally started our descent of the unmaintained mountain access roads, I get that nagging feeling that someone's there, and you just can't see them. So I turn on the CB to hear any nearby traffic from campers or all-night trail drivers and get nothing. Now this truck is 22 years old and has some issues now and then. But about 2 hours into the mountain, the pitch black in the cab gets interrupted by an orange check light, which goes back off about a minute later. It's now dark enough that I turn on the overhead power light to give myself some comfort to our surroundings. Just then, the CB, which I forgot was on, squealed out the worst static ever, and I jumped to turn it off. Looking back up, this huge deer was standing in the road, and I had to slam on the brakes, stalling the truck and bringing back the engine check light on. Now it's dark, the truck's off, and the check engine light is on, and the damn dog starts whining. I try the key and the engine whines, but no start. I sit there and wait a while, and hallelujah, it worked, and we got to the trailhead. Surprisingly, we found around 10 cars parked, which is a hell of a lot more than comfort permits, especially so far out alone. And when I get out of the cab, I notice a group of around 8 sitting on the overlook. They turn to me and say, "Glad you made it all right." I later realized that vantage point made it so that someone was able to watch us the whole 3-hour drive up the mountain. All the while I sat in the cab feeling so damn alone. Sure helps you remember there's always someone out there watching you, even if you think you're alone. This is one of my earliest creepy encounters. I was probably between the ages of 11 and 13 at the time, and it must have been around 1995. It was the weekend because I was hanging out late with my best friend. One of our favorite things to do at that age was rent movies and pop enormous amounts of popcorn to drench in butter and salt. We nearly always did this at my place. My parents were cooler, and we could stay up a bit later, make more noise, and it also helped that we could walk to the video stop from my house. Imagine my house at one corner of the street and the video store at the other. It's about a 7-minute walk and on the same side. It must not have been super late, because we hadn't rented our movies yet, but it was dark in a brightly lit neighborhood. The video store was located at the edge of my neighborhood on a busy street. At the time, this street was known for the fact that it was always lined with sex workers. The women were not usually located near the video store, but sort of congregated further along in each direction. The motel one way, and bars and bowling alleys the other. My mum was always very open with me about dangers, and I was always very aware and alert on the street, even though I had never felt unsafe before. It is very populated, but I guess it attracted creeps nonetheless. As we were walking along the street from my house to the video store, a car passes us, and we pull over a little bit ahead. I remember it was a dented old hatchback, and the colors were rust orange. We didn't make note of it. It was a residential street, and that's where people parked. As we got closer, I did note the passenger window was down. As we passed, the man inside shouted, "Hey!" I whipped my head around and could see vaguely an older man between 35 and 45 with large 70s-style glasses and a slightly bald head, maybe grey or light brown dishwater colour disheveled hair. I think he was wearing a dark jean jacket. I remember the buttons, just like jean jacket buttons and a collar. We turned back, kept walking and ignored him. He pulled ahead and stopped again. At that point I remember feeling hesitant. We both faltered in our walking, as if the instincts naturally halt your steps. But we did keep going at this time. As we passed, he said, "Hey girls, where you headin'?" We didn't stop or look and kept walking. I remember my friend saying something quietly along the lines of, "What the hell?" The man started following us slowly alongside. At some point he said, "You girls look cold." I have no idea if it was cold, but I do remember the time of year. But I remember those words very clearly. "I could give you a ride." My friend actually responded, "We don't need a ride," and he continued to follow us a little ways, speaking to us. "Where you heading? What are your names? How old are you?" He kept pestering us with these questions. When we were about just half a block from the video store, we ran the rest of the way. We saw him turn left at the intersection heading away from the store, and we took our time in there, and were flustered and kind of edgy at that point. And I remember telling the kindly proprietor of the video store that some guy had been harassing us. We opted to take a different way home, and thank God we did, because he was parked behind the video store. We could see the car at the other end of the lot from our location, running with the lights on. It was a one-way parking lot with one row of spaces, and we were located at the exit end in an alley. But he was right next to the entrance, and I'm sure would have just pulled out the wrong way had we walked down that street. He must have seen us anyway, because he began backing out. My friend shouted something and began running down the alley. Not to be left behind, I booked it. I'm a quick runner, so before long I was ahead of her, and I heard her behind me. "He's there!" I told her to follow me, and I cut through one of the yards that had no back gate, and I was shouting at my friend to hurry, because we had to get to my house by the time he came out the other end of the alley, or he might see us going into my yard. Thank God we made it to my house in time. My house fronted the street he would have turned on. Knowing which direction we cut through, it was on a corner, and my backyard/fence ran along the street that we were running on at that point. We had one neighbor to the left side of the house, and directly next to them, the alley. We cut into my yard through the gate and closed it, but didn't move. The fence was taller than us. If we walked up the back stairs, he would have seen us. I watched through a very tiny crack between the boards, and sure enough, seconds later he passed by slowly. As soon as we were sure he was far away enough, just before he could come around again, we booked it to my house. I think we were saved by the fact the alley had several high, sharp speed bumps. If you tried to take those things faster than a crawl, you would wreck your car. And as long as I've been driving, I have loved those speed bumps. And I'm not proud of this now, but I never told my mum the whole story. I was afraid that she would enforce restrictions on my freedom, and I just told her some old guy was hollering us out of his car. This is when she gave me the fight for your life, then and there talk. If anyone ever tries to grab you, fight for your life, gorge their eyes, scratch their face, kick them where the sun doesn't shine, whatever you do, whatever it takes. Never let them get you to another location. Love you, Mum. This happened around 2 years ago. My friend and I had been out late, driving around and going to our favorite spots around town. And when the night came to an end, we parked in front of her house and just talked for a while. It was 3 a.m. We lived in a big city, but this is one of the safer parts of town. It was late. The conversation was dying down when we suddenly heard and felt a distinct sound of movement, of someone opening and slamming one of the backseat doors of the trunk of my car. We looked at each other, looked back, and didn't see anything but still felt on edge. We decided instead of calling it, and her getting out, when we didn't know what we could be hiding near, that we should go to our favorite diner and check the trunk of the car there. Let me cut in real quick to say this isn't a paranormal story, but you could say that this is where it starts. It's what led to the night continuing instead of ending as we planned, and ultimately what led to the events that followed. The diner is a popular spot in town, open 24 hours and always busy. We befriended a few people who worked there and definitely felt it was the safest place to check my car. One of our friends who worked there checked with us, but there was nothing in the truck. We thanked them and headed down the hill back towards the home. We were just a few blocks away from where we live, stopped at a red light, and trying to joke off our little scare when we noticed him. We're in the left lane. He's in the car next to us. In the right, a blue Camaro with a modified engine. He was distinctive, bright blue eyes and several tattoos on his arms and face that we could see. The one I remember most vividly is the red teardrop tattoo underneath his left eye. Our windows were up, and our doors were locked. He rolled down his window and started catcalling us. We laughed and ignored him. This was normal. We could see his friend in that front seat, laughing too. Then his catcalls changed. "Hey, I'm not from here. Come hang out. Hop in." We started feeling a little more uncomfortable. We double-checked to make sure my doors were locked. The lights were taking forever, but it was a straight shot to my friend's place. That's when he got out the car, keys still in his ignition, and engine still on. "Hey, I'm not from here. I'm not from here," he started yelling, as he banged on my passenger window and pulled on the door handle. He was leaning down and looked into the car. "I'm not from here." The light turned green. He was still standing at my passenger window. I looked at my friend, looked at the light, and zoomed off, crossing into the lane furthest to the right. I wasn't going to lead this guy to my friend's house, and the police station was only a little less than a mile away. Right as I turned, he zoomed up behind me, and I knew he was trying to rear-end me, and would have if I hadn't have moved right then. I sped off towards the police station, him following behind. He gave up on trying to rear-end me, and switched to the left lane, swerving and trying to ram my car off the main road and into the cars parked on the side. His passenger window was down, and he was still screaming, "I'm not from here," intermixed with a few choice curse words. He was still trying to ram me, and I still didn't know how I managed to avoid him and avoid hitting any of the parked vehicles. The police station was only a few blocks away at this point. He tried to ram into my car again. I swerved away slightly into one of the residential streets as he continued forward, and I turned that swerve into a turn and zigzagged through the side streets. We heard his engine as he was searching the area for us. We took the side streets slowly, keeping an ear out for his engine, and parked with the lights off for a few minutes, if we felt he was too close. A while later, we made it to the police station and pulled into the emergency zone. The entire chase took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. We dialed 911, something we hadn't thought to do at the height of it all. One came outside to escort us to our homes. There were squad cars waiting at the end of my friend's block when I dropped her off. Our escort followed me home to make sure I arrived safely. This is the only part of the night I have a picture of, the police escort. I haven't had an experience like this since, and I've been more careful about being out late at night. I've seen this guy with the face tattoos more than once since then. A few months ago, he was a passenger this time staring into my car. I didn't notice anything until a different friend started making faces at him. I saw him, saw his big blue eyes and his red teardrop tattoo, and immediately told my friend to stop and get us out of there. I didn't need another experience like that again. To the man with the teardrop tattoo and the blue Camaro to match, let's not meet. I live in Big Bear, California, and I was 13 when it first started. It was the middle of February, and I would sometimes go outside at night to take out the trash or to take a break from my family. But one day at night I saw someone standing across the street on my neighbor's property. It was a man wearing dark clothes. He looked around 5'11" to 6 foot. I wasn't able to see his face, but I could see his stare burning into my soul. It was dark outside already, so I went inside feeling uncomfortable. 2 months passed and the man kept watching. I tried telling my dad, but he thought I was being paranoid about someone walking at night and thinking that the stranger was looking at me. I didn't go outside so much after that, more of the fear that something might happen. One day my mum told me to take out the trash at night. I saw him 4 to 5 feet away from me. I dropped the trash and went back in and told my parents. My father went out but didn't see anyone and called me a liar and resumed watching TV. I went to my room and looked out the window and saw him. He was hiding behind one of the cars in the driveway and came out of hiding and went back in. He looked at me through the window. I didn't go outside at night anymore. From June all the way till August, when my first high school year started, I started to walk to the bus stop alone. Then I spent 2 months walking in the morning every day at 7 a.m. The bus would arrive at 7:15, and I would always arrive at the bus stop at 7:10. I would always go to a nearby liquor store to buy a drink, and one night, when daylight savings started, I saw the man standing on the intersection that I lived next to. Thankfully, my neighbor was outside, so I yelled good morning at him, hoping it would show the man that there was someone outside with me, and he would walk away, and thank heavens, that is exactly what happened. I would walk to the bus, always with my phone out and my flashlight on, and sometimes I would be on call with someone to make myself comfortable walking in the dark. One day I got my phone taken away, so I was stuck walking in the dark. That's when I heard crunching footsteps behind me. It was the man right behind me following. I started to pick up the speed and saw he did the same. I saw the street to my brother's house and started running. When I got to the house, I started to bang on the door, yelling to let me in, and the man got closer and closer, reaching out his hand to grab me. And thankfully my brother opened the door and I pushed him out of the way and slammed the door shut. I was in tears and tried so hard to tell him, and I finally got the words out. My brother went out with a bat and a flashlight and saw a tall man running in the woods behind my brother's house. That morning my brother took me and I told a friend about it, and he started to pick me up at my house and walk me to the bus stop. The last time I saw the man, it was around 11 a.m. He was across the street. He waved at me and said in a voice full of nightmares, "See you one day," and walked away. I'm now 16, so it's still recent, and I'm scared to walk alone or even being home alone. I really hope not to encounter that strange man again. We lived in an old mill house converted into about 3 stories of flats. We were in the loft/attic conversion, and it was easily my favorite flat in the world. The main door led straight outside, so we didn't have to deal with a close, and the staircase was wrought iron. Downstairs, we had the most ridiculous, stereotypical Scottish junkies. They were shooting up constantly. They had 4 kids in a tiny one-bedroom flat. They were abusive towards each other, constantly shouting and screaming, banging on walls, the whole 9 yards. They would wake us up at 3 a.m. having loud-ass parties with their junkie friends. One night I finished a stock take at my work and didn't get home till 4 a.m. I walked upstairs, and as I passed their door I heard the worst noise in the world. As someone that was then training to be a teacher, this honestly had me crying like a baby. I heard a little girl screaming for her dad to stop hurting her. She was crying and begging, and it tore me apart. I called the police, which we had done before for noise reasons, and told them that it sounded like a small child was being beaten, and then, well, you can guess what was happening. And that if they didn't get there within 10 minutes, myself and my husband would need to deal with it. 3 cars, a riot van, and a social worker showed up within 5 minutes, and I was waiting outside for them. The scum bastard was actually doing that to his 3-year-old daughter, while his friends shot up and watched. The social worker let me hug the little girl while they got everyone situated. She was tiny. This little tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket sobbing in my lap. It ruined me. I couldn't sleep properly for months. They were arrested, the kids sent away, and I never knew what happened after that. They never came back. We left 6 months later. This happened to me about 2 years ago. For reference, I'm a 30-year-old female, on the petite side, living on the East Coast where the sun rises aren't until 6:37 in the winter. I worked opening shift to Starbucks as a manager, and on these particular shifts, I picked up the girl I opened with because she lived nearby and didn't have a car. This takes place at around 4:30 in the morning and it's very dark. I'm driving down an empty main road, decently close to the girl's apartment complex, when an old kind of beat-up forest green sedan seemingly comes out of nowhere and is behind me. We're the only cars on the road. I turn on my blinkers to turn a light on at the way of the complex, which is in a very dark area behind a bunch of offices and developments. I'm about 5 minutes away. The first red flag for me is how quickly the car turns on their blinkers after I do. They start speeding up a bit. I speed up, and they match my speed. I get a bad feeling, so I figured I'd take an unexpected turn to lose them and circle back. As soon as my blinker turns on, so do theirs. Any turn I take, they are taking it too. I'm freaking out after a few minutes of trying to lose them, so I pull into a nursing home and assume they'll give up. Well, so do they with no turn signals. Mind you, because they weren't expecting it, and they're parking across from me. I see the driver, and it's a woman, probably in her 50s with a small white dog. She looks slightly unkempt, but not crazy or out of it, just a dumpy little middle-aged woman. She rolls down her window, so I roll down mine and ask, "Is everything okay?" She replies in a sort of mumble. "I thought you were my friend. She has the same kind of car," or something along those lines. I've never seen her before, so I say, "Okay, no problem, have a good day." Weird. I shrug it off and go my own way. I wasn't too shaken up, but if it had been a man, I would have straight up called 911 immediately. As I leave the parking lot, the woman began following me again. I'm close to this girl's complex on some very dark roads and I'm freaking out. But I figure she's obviously not quite right in the head, and she would not pull into a big apartment complex parking lot. Well, I was wrong. I'm at a stop sign right before the entrance, crazy lady behind me and all, when I notice a red fox scurry by. This is only important because I strongly believe in signs from the universe, so it's a weird coincidence I see my favorite animal in this moment of terror. I pull into the complex parking lot and the crazy lady parks next to me. We're just sitting there for a moment, neither of us looking at each other. I lock my doors, and roll down my passenger side window halfway, finger on the button in case things get weird. She rolls down her driver's side window and I ask her straightforwardly, "Why are you following me?" She then replies, "I'm following you?" and then repeats what she said to me the last time at the parking lot. She thought I was her friend. It was very strange, almost scripted. Now I'm feeling very uneasy because it's extremely obvious she had been, and I know it isn't smart to mention I'm meeting someone. So I say, "Well, I'm clearly not, and I'm here to pick up a friend. So, I'm not sure what to tell you." I roll up my window, and she watches me take out my phone and call my employee, who I say, "Come down this second," and she leaves immediately once I'm on the phone. My employee rushes down and I explain what happened, and we both agree it's creepy as hell. As we pull out of the complex entrance, the red fox runs in front of the car, causing me to slam on my brakes, stop, and it runs off into the same woods on the other side of the road. I've never forgotten this morning ever. So crazy lady with the little white dog, let's not meet again. This happened back on Christmas 2019, which means that it got dark outside pretty early. I've always enjoyed the dark, and you can say that I'm quite the horror fan, so I don't usually get scared that easily. Back then I was doing a robotics after-school activity with two of my friends. I don't anymore since the whole quarantine thing happened. I always took the school bus to go home, but it left me a little further away from my home because the bus driver needed to go a different route to leave the others, which meant I had to walk along 3 different streets in order to get home. As I said, I enjoy the dark, but in that particular place, it made me feel uncomfortable. That place being the first road I had to walk. It had only a few lights and was very long, but the thing that made me really uncomfortable was the fact that you would barely see other people. For the most part, every time I had to walk down the street, I was alone. The day the incident happened, I was about to start walking towards the buses because we were finished with our lessons. On my way, I was talking to a friend. We were basically chatting about what we were going to do in the afternoon, when out of nowhere I decided to tell him about the street. He seemed to make fun of the fact that it gave me chills, and I laughed too just because I didn't want to start an argument. At least, that's what I remember thinking. It was about 5:10 when the bus started to leave the school. It usually is about an hour-and-a-half ride because of the amount of kids they have to take, but I had no problem with that, and I just sat and did my own thing, listening to music and drawing on my sketchbook, and had a little chat with some people on the bus to kill some time. It was around 6:30 when I finally arrived at my stop, and as usual I had plenty of walking to do. The area was pretty illuminated as always, but when I started walking down the street, it felt like the power went down or something. As I walked deeper in, I started to lose the light of the area I started from. Now I know that some of you are probably going to be thinking that if this road bothered me so much, why didn't I tell my parents so they could change the stop or something? I was just shy to tell anyone really, in the fear that they'd make fun of me. Well, what I experienced didn't make it hilarious at all. As I was walking down, I thought I saw this old lady coming my way from the distance. I didn't think much of it. When we were too close and about to pass each other, I could see her face even better. I'm pretty sure that she was in her early 70s for sure, and she gave me this grumpy mad look. Now I'm used to being polite to others, no matter how bad they might be. So by the time I passed her, I just said, "Good evening," but she didn't respond. She kept staring at me and looked angry. After that, she walked right past me and mumbled the word, "Beware." I was a bit disturbed by that, but tried to ignore it since, it could mean anything. I kept walking down the street, and as I was going, I passed this house. It was sort of an old house that was on the right side of a small road for your car to get in, I guess. But it wasn't just that. I saw the outline of someone tall just standing there. I was 100% sure at that moment I passed, his eyes were glued on mine. But he did nothing, just stood there. After almost arriving to the end of the street, I froze. when I heard the sounds of footsteps behind me. I tried to look back, and there he was. The same outline was right behind me, not moving, but I could understand that he was looking at me. I kept forward, pretending that I wasn't suspicious. One part of me said this man was dangerous, while the other said that he must have just been walking down the same street. The first part got the better of me, and I kept walking as I heard the footsteps persistently follow. When I reached the end of the street, I stopped and sighed, as he couldn't see me anymore, and I started to walk quicker down the other street. This one had cars, which was a huge relief. When I was finally outside my house, I pressed the doorbell. Usually my parents took a while to open the door, so I stayed there and waited. But then, the few seconds it took for them to come to the door, I could hear down the street, and it felt like the sound of someone running. I didn't think much of it at first, but started to feel worried while the footsteps came ever closer and louder. Standing by the door, as I saw him, the man from the street was sprinting. It looked like he was trying to find someone, and I felt my heart drop as I saw a glimpse of him running by. Thankfully, he didn't recognize me because of how fast he was going, but by the time I started pressing the bell consistently in panic, and it finally opened, I sprinted inside and told my parents everything. They told me it was just probably a random dude, minding his own business. I never told anyone after that, as I thought I'd be ridiculed, but I have a pretty strong indication in my gut that he was after me. Thankfully, I've never seen him again. The last 2 times I had an after-school class, my father came and picked me up at least. It's been about 5 months since the incident, but I don't think I'll ever forget the man with a spring in his step, shall we say. I just had a run-in with the same middle-aged guy who had been showing up around me in a white Fiat today. Here's the backstory. The first time I saw him was while I was sitting at a red light near my house with my windows down a month ago. He pulled up next to me and started talking to me about how nice my car is, asking if I race it, and other questions along those lines. Totally didn't seem creepy at first. However, some days after that, I took a back road to my now previous job. As I'm coming down the road, the same car with the same dude pulls out behind me from an empty business parking lot. I could definitely tell it was him from looking in my mirrors. He continued to follow me to my work, but continued on straight when I turned into the parking lot. Little weird, I thought to myself, but hey, coincidences do happen, so I wasn't sweating it. Sometime after that, my buddy told me about an awesome Korean restaurant he went to, so I decided to take my girlfriend on a date there. Mind you, this restaurant is a good hour's drive away from my house and a totally different direction than my previous work. Probably 10 or so minutes away from the restaurant. Yet again, the same dude pulls behind me in traffic, doesn't pass me, just follows until I turn in and continues on straight. This is where I really start to get a weird feeling. Seeing someone in the same city isn't that weird, but I've now run into the guy in 3 very different areas. Now fast forward to today. I'm working a new job installing patio covers that require my boss and I to work in different customers' backyards, so I drive to the customer's house 1 city over and get to work. The day went well. I cleaned up and walked from the customer's backyard to the front where my vehicle is. As I'm walking to my car, I kid you not, this dude is parked out front of my customer's house, on the street, in the same white Fiat. This really creeped me out, so I kinda hopped in my car quickly and got ready to leave. However, he starts talking to me and said/asked almost exactly the same stuff he did the first time. How nice my car is, if I do street racing, and what had been done to my car. After a few questions, he drove off. In other words, he parked in an empty church parking lot up the road by the intersection that I needed to leave through. When I start driving, sure enough, I roll up to the stop sign and he pulls out behind me. At this point, I'm just not liking this situation at all. I didn't want this dude potentially following me home, so I got on the gas and got as much distance as I could from him safely. I really hope not to see the guy again. I could be overreacting, but I feel like there's no way this dude just accidentally follows me 4 times in a very spaced out location in a somewhat small span of time. It just doesn't seem right. It's not like I drove a Ferrari or anything. I had a Miata and a Focus ST. Nice, sure, but nothing really that special or out the ordinary. When I was in 9th grade, I switched from a private school to a public one because of money and my mom working way too hard to pay for it. My dad had died when I was 10, and she had raised me by herself since. I adapted quickly since I already knew some kids from the school, so naturally started hanging out with their friends too. In this group of friends, there was one pretty shy kid, but he was friendly with everyone, so I just hung out with him too like everyone else did. One day this kid completely out the blue asks me what kind of flowers I liked. I told him I wasn't a big fan of flowers, but I thought daisies were pretty, and then he said he was going to take some to my father's grave. I obviously got weirded out and nervous, but kind of ignored it. Once we graduated from junior high and left to different high schools, I completely forgot about this dude until 2 years later he knocks at the door of my house and asks if he can come in. I took it as a friend just showing up and saying hi, so let him in. I was usually alone most of the time because Mum worked most of the day, so I offered him something to drink. He said no to any offer and asks how I'd been doing. I told him I was fine, and when he asks if I'd been doing anything fun, I mentioned how I started playing guitar and showed him what I had taught myself. The guy bursts into tears. He says he's sorry and runs out my house. I told no one because I really didn't understand and didn't want to make him uncomfortable. About a month later, he shows up again at my house. This time, my mum wasn't there either. He said he was walking around the neighborhood, completely across town from his house by the way, and asks if he could use the restroom. I let him in and was sitting by the kitchen table and chatting with my then boyfriend. When he comes out of the restroom, he asks if I like surprises. I got super weirded out and told him that it depends on which kind of surprise, and he pulls out a rose from under his shirt. He offers it to me. I was absolutely confused and weirded out, and when he sees my reaction, he started getting sort of angry. "Don't you like it?" "Oh, it's super nice, but I'm not a huge fan of flowers, to be honest." Then he starts laughing maniacally, and said it didn't matter a bit. The rose is off its stalk, and chews it and swallows it while laughing. I'm in complete shock. He walks out the house and I lock all the doors immediately. I told my boyfriend and he asked me to pretend not to be there if he showed up again, or to not to let him in if I was alone. A few months after the incident, I went to a party on a Friday and was sleeping until late the next day. My mum worked early Saturday and didn't wake me up when she left for work. I woke up for water around 11 a.m. and saw my mum had left a note on the kitchen counter and said that a friend of mine had come early to visit, and he told her he would wait outside for me to wake up. This was at 7:50. I looked out the window and saw the same guy sleeping under our house tree with his headphones on. I got super spooked and closed my curtains and stayed in my room until my mum got home from work. When she did around 2:30, I heard her outside speaking with the guy and telling him that I was probably still asleep and asked him to come another time. The guy stayed outside my house from 7:50 to 2:30 just creeping. I told the whole story to my mum, and she said that he was probably so in love that he didn't know what to do, and she told me to date him out of pity because, well, that's how my mum is, but I obviously didn't. A few weeks later, after I was returning home from school, I found him asleep outside as well. I asked him what was going on, and he said that it was just his favorite place to sleep, and that he did it often. He then laughed crazily and ran. My best friend was already old enough to buy alcohol, and we used to drink a lot back then because that was what rebellious teens did. I was still 16, and she came over to my house and we would go together to buy booze and then get coffee and wait for our friends. I had told her about the guy and the weird experiences I had had, but she didn't know who he was. We left my house just as this guy was arriving, and my friend, being super nice, was not understanding the million faces and looks I was giving her and asked him if he wanted to tag along, to which he agreed. He then proceeds to follow us in absolute silence all the way to the store, to buy the booze and then back to the coffee shop. We sit at our table, and every time my friend tries to include him in the conversation, he would just give her 1 or 2 word answers and continue in silence. He heard us talk for over an hour before he just stood up and left. After that, I blocked him on all social media and haven't heard from him since. Every time I talked about the things he did around me to other people that know him, they've all told me how he's super normal to everyone else, and no one can believe how he's that strange around me. But in all honesty, I'm scared he's just gonna show up again one day and start acting super weird once more. I was on my way home from a rather long trip with my mother. We got to a bridge where we saw an elderly woman in a nightgown. Think Grandma Death / Roberta Sparrow from Donnie Darko. It was fall, so rather cool, and the sun was already setting behind the trees, so the white nightgown really showed in the dark. She was just walking. The problem was she was barefoot and completely clean, like nothing had touched her at all. We had been on this road before the bridge for at least 10 miles, and we had another 15 before we got to anything that even resembled civilization. It's the road, and had ample trees for miles and miles around. We stopped and asked her where she was going and if she was with anyone. She just kept mumbling to herself, but I remember her eyes. Her eyes were as wide as if she'd just seen something frightening. The whites of her eyes were bleached white, and the pupils were a straight jet black. She never made eye contact and just kept walking forward. We drove off and called the police. We both just kept expecting to see a car ahead for her, but there was nothing. Stuff like that doesn't happen at all out here, so it was pretty startling to say the least. Very plausible that it was dementia or something along those lines, but once more, walking barefoot so many miles deep onto this road is just unheard of. If anything, that scared us more. I had turned 18 just a few weeks ago, and due to the pandemic and all, I wouldn't be able to throw a big party. So I just had 2 of my closest friends over, Melissa and Clara, who were also 18. We planned instead to have some fun for the evening before I turned 18, make a fancy dinner, and have some fun. We didn't have any alcohol. It's legal to drink beer and wine and stuff at 16, and hard liquor at 18 where I live. Just as midnight rolled around, we celebrated. I unwrapped their gifts, one of which was one of those really realistic looking seal plushies. It's kind of an in-joke. I went through a phase where I found fat seals incredibly adorable and got Instagram ads for those things all the time. Anyway, we were really hyped up at that point and decided to go for a walk with our music box and plushies at 1 AM. You know, as you do. And just for context, I live in a relatively small rural town next to a big lake. We get a bunch of tourists in the summer and also have multiple clinics around, one for eating disorders and there's another rehab center. But it's usually really safe, and especially at night. So there we are, dancing, singing aloud on the empty streets, just having fun and enjoying my newfound adultness. We pass a few people on the streets, but they all seem normal and nice, and it's generally empty and deserted. As we approach a big empty parking lot, which we needed to pass in order to get back to my house, I noticed a guy in a dark hooded pullover coming from the parking lot and crossing the street to the side that we were walking on. We turned the music down as he passed, and he greeted us briefly in passing, as it's customary to do here in the countryside. We also greeted the other people that we previously passed, and we greeted him back. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, but seemed totally non-threatening and normal to us at that point. We thought nothing more of it, and walked on and turned the music back up. Now, in order to get to my home, we had to go through a small patch of woods, where there were no streetlights nor empty houses. As we started approaching that area, a few minutes after we met the man, we suddenly started hearing talking from behind us, and realized someone was walking at least 10 meters away. At first, we thought he was talking to someone on the phone, and as it was pretty dark, we couldn't see if this was the case. When we passed one of the last streetlights before the patch of woods, we realized it was the same guy that had walked past us just a few minutes prior, who was walking in the opposite direction than us, and had turned around after he passed us in order to be right behind us now. That was when we really started to get creeped out. We also realized he wasn't on the phone because of the loud music we had on. We couldn't make out what he was saying. And in that moment, I, for some reason, figured it would be a good idea to say, "I always have a knife with me." They later told me they actually brought it, but in reality we had nothing with us, in case we had to defend ourselves. I kind of figured out that maybe it would scare the guy off, but it didn't. There was one last house, which was actually an inn, that maybe we would pass before going into the patch of woods. I told my friends perhaps he was staying there, but we all agreed that if he kept following us at that point, it couldn't be a coincidence and that he was indeed following us. In hindsight, we should have just turned around at that point and stayed in the well-lit populated area, but I guess we weren't thinking very clearly. So we passed the inn and he was still following. One of us turned their phone flashlight on, as there were no more streetlights and it was pitch black where we were going. We kept turning around and checking if he was still behind us, each time increasing our walking speed more and more until we were practically running, but he kept getting closer and closer. My heart felt like it was going to beat out my chest. I was scared for my life. I kept thinking that he could have some kind of weapon with him or something to harm me. Then one of my friends, Melissa, stopped and turned around. Clara and me stood a few meters behind her, and immediately the guy approached her, asking her if we had any alcohol or cigarettes. She answered in a totally sober tone that we in fact didn't have anything with us. He took a few steps towards her, asking again if we really didn't have anything that we could give him. Melissa answered more firmly this time that we don't have anything, and the guy seemed desperate. At that point, Melissa said she was ready to kick him in the balls if he even took another step. She actually does kickboxing and stuff, so knows how to defend herself quite well. But still, he was a grown man and probably had more power than an 18-year-old girl. Clara and me were just frozen and didn't know what to do and just kept standing there saying nothing. He asked Melissa if we lived nearby or if we were here on vacation, to which she answered that we lived in the area, as she figured it's better if he thinks we know the area and the people well, so he wouldn't get any ideas. Luckily for us, after a few more attempts of reassuring him that we didn't have anything for him, I think the guy realized he was getting nowhere and decided to just turn around and walk away, leaving us scared half to death as we walked back to my house, glancing behind us every few seconds to check. We arrived safely at my home, still scared, and I locked the door behind us and triple-checked it. I couldn't really fall asleep that night, always thinking that I heard something outside. So creepy grown man who decided to follow 3 18-year-olds in the dark, in the middle of the woods at night? What the heck were you thinking? I used to work as a paramedic in a county an hour away and 2 counties away. I would have to start work driving at around 5:30 a.m. in order to commute the hour away and be on time. This day, I was one of the only cars on the road, which was normal. I pulled up to a traffic circle and noticed a van sitting in the circle waiting, but there was 0 traffic. I found this odd and pulled up next to him and continued through the circle. He then began to follow me to the interstate, which I didn't think anything of. I was driving for about an hour and remember seeing someone near me as I went in and out of a pack of cars, still not really thinking much into it in my early morning brain. I pulled off the interstate and saw the van behind me. Now I was like, what are the chances of this guy following me for an hour to get here? And I became alert. I decided to pull into a gas station to see if he or she were following me, and of course it pulled in behind. I noticed it parked facing the storefront with its lights off, just outside of the lights of the parking lot. At this point I'm very concerned. It was Sunday, and I remember this because Chick-fil-A was closed. I got back in my truck and it began to follow me again. I shot one parking lot over to the Chick-fil-A and began speeding around the building in an attempt to get behind the van to get a tag. I was trying the entire time to use my cell phone to call the police, and I'm not sure if it was adrenaline or just a true glitch, but the phone wouldn't work. This happened a few times with the old phone years ago when I needed to pull the battery out to reset it. After several circles around this restaurant, just as I got behind the van, it took off heading back towards the interstate. It was one of the creepiest encounters I've ever had. Years later, I still wonder what his intentions were. This last December, a group of friends and myself decided to take a trip up to northern Michigan to visit some family from southern Oklahoma. Now, the drive up there typically doesn't allow for a pass through Chicago, but we decided to detour and take a trip through the Windy City. We enter downtown right by Soldier Field. At about 4 a.m. we have this wild assumption that Chicago is going to be lined up and down the streets with all-night pizza joints. We find nothing. Defeated and hungry, we decide to stop by a 24-hour Subway and grab something there. Now, this wasn't your typical Subway Eat Fresh sandwich shop. In the back booths are a group of hobos cuddled up sleeping and a plethora of shady-looking characters. The creepiest by far was the cab driver, who was in a booth alone wearing all black, hunched, hood over his face, just devouring his sandwich in silence. This cab driver happened to overhear us talking about wanting some Chicago-style pizza, and as he takes a break from looking creepy and absolutely devouring his sweet onion chicken teriyaki, he says, "You want pizza?" We quickly turn in unison and say, "Yeah?" He goes back to eating, and we awkwardly stare, waiting for some sort of help from this guy. "Do you know of any place open?" He stopped eating for a moment and says, "Yeah," and goes back to eating. By this point, I just want pizza and to get the hell out of there, so I say, "Could you give us directions?" He looks up again and says, "Yeah, it's on the other side of Chinatown on Archer and Station." Excited as hell, the four of us cheer in excitement, say thank you and pile out to the door, and as we all turn to leave, we hear the creepiest chuckle coming from the cab driver. It wasn't entirely unlike Jafar's laugh from Aladdin. Shocked and a little scared, we all turn slowly on our heels and I say, "Why do you laugh?" He looks up and has this "I'm luring you into something horrible" look on his face and says, "You're not walking there, are you?" I reply with a "No," and he says nothing and continues eating. All of us being a little freaked out, we hurry to the car and drive towards our destination. We get 2 blocks and realize why the guy asked if we were walking. I've never been so scared to be stuck at a stoplight in my life. The 30 minutes we spent in Chicago at 4 a.m. were some of the scariest in my entire life. I've been to Chicago, but Chicago ghetto at 4 a.m. is hell. People trying to attack our car, crack addicts walking to our vehicle, guys in ski masks, street races, gangs, car wrecks, the works. We never did get our pizza. I am a gay male who grew up in the southern US, the actual Bible Belt, and for reasons unbeknownst to even me, chose to stay in that region for college. Early 2000s, directly post 9/11. A huge chunk of people, both students and faculty staff, were quite politically and religiously conservative in their thinking. While I disliked that aspect, it was not at all unfamiliar to me. Hell, as a teen I was actually subject to the occasional intervention about my non-attendance at church and unsaved status. The post 9/11 aftermath only served to amplify the whole God, family, and country mentality. Unlike many of my fellow LGBT students, I admittedly had a chip on my shoulder about it. Contrary to what some may think, there are bastions of liberal/progressive belief in such an environment. As such, groups and circles were quite supportive of anyone who chose to be openly opposed to the predominant mindset. As such, I felt sufficiently assured and confident to be very out and proud, as well as non-conventional in other ways. If that all were not enough, I've never been one to exhibit that stereotypically southern warmth and extroversion. I may be courteous and civil, but I'm also quite happy for strangers to remain strangers. Of course, all of this to say that somehow, for reasons I still cannot grasp, I ended up on the radar of some dude, a titler who would be friend, whose time and energy probably would have been much better spent on someone more amiable and compatible. And before I continue, I need to emphasize, this guy refused to take no for an answer. So I'm in the midst of my senior year in college, engaged in such tasks as completing what's left of my degree requirements, applying to grad programs, and just generally finishing off my undergrad career on an uplifting note. I had really shifted my focus away from extracurricular interests and more towards academics and some semblance of a social life. I had my meals in the university cafeteria, where I'd eat either in solitude or with a few friends, depending on our schedules. One day though, I'm just eating my lunch, and some guy comes up and sits down near me and starts chatting me up, introducing himself as Ron. Right away, this guy Ron is obviously quite outgoing and extroverted, and he really seems to be one of the types who's never met a stranger, the very opposite of me. He was seemingly trying to get to know me by striking up a conversation, and as we tend to say in Let's Not Meet, I thought nothing about it. For my own part, while I did not share his interest in socializing, I was not adverse to the interaction or repelled by him either. He seemed like a decent and personable enough guy, so I made some effort to be nice and participate in the conversation, if only passively. And that's generally how it goes with me. I'm not especially motivated to reach out to strangers, or even casual acquaintances in an attempt to socialize, but depending on the situation and context, I tend to be cooperative and cordial to someone who tries to chat me up by making some effort to respond to their prompts. I know what it's like to feel ignored or unheard because the other person gives only the most terse and emotionless response. So I genuinely try to do better by offering actual substantive responses to their statements and questions. In that respect, I did the traditional Southern preoccupation of manners and politeness, and did in fact rub off on me in a manner of speaking. All that said, I'm not feeling a mutual interest and desire to engage. Then, I'm not feeling it. It's nothing personal against the other, but I can't force it either. Usually, for me to develop a friendship with a new person, it involves some combination of the following: common interest, shared activity, other type of common ground, or repeatedly casual and friendly interactions over a span of time. Again though, if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it does not. To continue. As it turned out, Ron was a freshman, so he was a few years younger than me, with a bit less life experience by comparison. At college age, I felt like 18 versus 21 is still a reasonably significant difference in terms of maturity and wisdom. Moreover, this was likely his first time living in a novel environment, away from his more familiar surroundings of home, school, and church. Finally, with Ron being such an outgoing guy, it's possible he was very well accustomed to successfully making friends with new people by spontaneously approaching and chatting them up. Combine that with my non-committal politeness, and I suppose he decided I was going to be a new addition to his social circle. Again, at this stage I had nothing against the guy because he seemed like a perfectly decent fellow. So when he wanted to exchange phone numbers, I complied. And then he talked about wanting us to hang out sometime. I was copacetic to the idea, in other words. I had no genuine interest in doing so, but I was not actively opposed to the idea either. As some weeks and months passed, he did continue to pursue the idea. The problem was, although I was amiable, I was only amiable in theory. In reality, though, I simply had no interest in this person and therefore no motivation to reciprocate or pursue friendship. At that point, I had nothing against him. He seemed like a perfectly okay and decent person, with whom I simply didn't click socially. In my mind, No harm, no foul. Right now, some people may think I should have simply told him directly that I was not interested. Perhaps you may not be so quick to assume that would have worked in my case, but regardless though, I simply declined to reciprocate his efforts. You can think of me of what you will. You can judge me either for not wanting to be friends or for not directly saying, sorry, not interested. But either way, I'm not reciprocating. Then surely the most logical response on his part would have been to simply realize I have no interest and move on, right? Well, that's not how Ron would end up dealing with it. And in hindsight, his subsequent behavior completely validates my initial distance and non-engagement. Maybe I unconsciously perceived it. Like I said, at first the guy was simply friendly and polite, a bit excessively persistent about his efforts to befriend me, so I really had nothing against him either. I probably imagined in the back of my mind that he would just give up and move on of his own accord. Instead, one day in the college cafeteria, he approaches me as per usual, and seems his usual outgoing and friendly self, but then he switches gears and confronts me. Ron didn't raise his voice or even verbally attack me, if anything. His tone was somewhat casual and civil, and he brings up the fact that I had not reciprocated his efforts, in a fairly accusatory manner. As I recall, something like, "You know, you've been kind of rude to me." Basically, in his mind, it was a matter of him kindly offering to hand a friendship, and me unkindly rejecting it. My rudeness apparently consisted of me never calling him or taking him up by the hand of friendship that he was supposedly extending. I guess he thought he would admonish me for my misdeeds, and I would repent over it and consequently mend my ways. Problem is, I have a heightened sensitivity to any kind of manipulation via guilt, shame, cajoling, self-doubt, gaslighting, etc. On account of experiencing such things while growing up. You know, statements like, "Well, I'd be ashamed. That's just selfish. I was really disappointed that you XYZ. Now what would your dead great-grandma think? Well, that's just silly." By sensitive, I don't mean that it works well on me. On the contrary, I mean that it makes my hair stand on end and generally puts me on high alert. If I was politely non-compliant before, then I'll be overtly hostile and adversarial after. On some level, I'm basically thinking, that's it, screw you, trifle with my thoughts or emotions, I think not. Needless to say, Ron attempts at scolding me had the exact opposite effect of whatever he intended. I had nothing against him previously, but him confronting me like this really flipped a mental switch. I was not yet of a mind to be confrontational or hostile, but I no longer felt obligated to be nice either. The exchange that followed was, to put it mildly, very awkward and uncomfortable, and in hindsight it was the first sign that he had some difficulty in respecting other people's boundaries and personal autonomy. I don't remember exactly what he said, but I basically rejected him to take on events and maintained that I did nothing wrong. I simply told him that I had been as courteous as I could reasonably be under the circumstances. Following his pushy badgering, my reserves of niceness had already run dry. My overall attitude was one of, sorry you feel that way, but too bad. After all, if I don't want to be someone's friend, they don't have to like it. But it's still my prerogative to make the call, right? Not in Ron's mind. What if I expect more out of you? Then you have a problem there. Quite honestly, I was completely taken aback by this. From my perspective, I had no problem, because of the simple fact that his expectation had no concerns of mine. Like, did he sincerely believe that any expectation that he formed entailed some manner of moral or ethical obligation on my part? Really? What kind of person thinks like that? Needless to say, I didn't even know how to reply because, well, it's fruitless attempting to reason with the unreasonable. God damn it, Ron. Then Ron went on to ask why I had not returned his gestures of friendship, to which I simply responded that I'd never felt compelled to. Naturally, he wants to know why not. I could only think to myself, why am I expected to justify my lack of desire to be friends? I wish I had more of a smart-ass answer and said something like, why am I not compelled? How about the lack of a reason that I would be compelled? What is this guy's problem? I mean, his thoughts, statements, and behaviors, none of it is rational. Around the time, having to deal with him was awkward and distressing, thanks in no small part to my growing sense of having momentarily stumbled out of reality. Looking back, I realized he was basically engaging in a form of gaslighting, though perhaps not knowingly, as he seemed genuinely to believe his own words, however nonsensical. The interaction of course ended on a sour note, and he put on this demeanor like I'd disappointed him, while it was just uncomfortable for me, and I was eager to move on. I hoped that would be the end of it. We'd go our separate ways and speak no more. I'd hope. Instead, it was only a short while later, a mere 3 weeks, that Ron approached me in the cafeteria, putting on his default friendly outgoing demeanor like our previous interactions hadn't happened at all. I still remembered it though, so I was taken aback that he was actually attempting to engage me in conversation. "Hey man, what's up?" At this point he was just inviting himself into my personal space where he was not welcome, and generally being inappropriately pushy. And this is really where I went from passively averse to actively hostile, because enough was enough. As previously mentioned, while I may not have been friendly in the extrovert outgoing sense, I'm generally nice. At first I just ignored him. By then, he should have known full well that any communication from him was completely unwelcome. The silent treatment may sound petty, but I didn't care. Of course, he just had to inquire as to why I didn't respond. These days, when I remember having said that, I recalled that I was upset and under distress, but not afraid for my safety. It never even crossed my mind to worry about any retaliation. I just told him off, fully, blunt and harsh, pulling zero punches, and it really makes me think about all the women out there who have to be careful in responding to unwanted advances, out of fear for their own safety, and I feel deeply for them. I didn't even raise my voice, yet my tone was unmistakable, leaving no room for argument. He got this hurt puppy dog look on his face, and needless to say, he does not get the hell away. Instead decides to stick around and interrogate and challenge my sentiment, wanting to know what he can do to reconcile or whatever. Again at this point, where I wonder if I've unknowingly walked into a portal out of my own world and into some kind of bizarre backwards world, where all of this made sense. It was almost as if he was treating the situation like a courtroom case. Rather than dignify his nonsense by directly engaging, I simply reiterate that I don't want to have anything to do with him. I was honestly just tired at this point, and I cut him off when he tried to protest or plead. The dude continued to persist for a while, but thankfully he did eventually give up and walk away. Shortly after that, he gave up for good and left me alone, right? After all, being told to get the hell away from someone surely establishes unmistakably that that friendship is off the table, right? For a much longer time he didn't approach me. He passed me on the sidewalk once and said good afternoon, but I didn't say a word back. No contact, if you will. And it seemed like he was getting the message to leave me alone. But it didn't last. 2 months later in the cafeteria, he approaches me again and starts off with an apology in a moment of optimism. I thought maybe he was going to apologize for having to be so pushy in the past, and goes on his merry way. Wrong. Instead, he simply started the same tired old nonsense about how he wanted to be friends. Needless to say, I let him know again that I had no interest in that. You know, the same thing I'd expressed multiple times already, in such explicit terms that even a complete idiot could not have mistaken its meaning. Then he starts begging me for an explanation, which I absolutely did not owe him. I stupidly made an attempt at some sort of explanation by pointing out his behavior at the time, namely disrespecting my wishes, invading my personal space, and then he had the nerve to say stuff like that it was not an issue of personal space, that I was making stuff up. For some reason his rebuttal and the personal space topic included something about his brother having died some years back. That's sad and all, but it was completely irrelevant, so okay then. I then even tried pointing out this kind of persistent, pushy, space-invading, boundary-violating behavior spoke very poorly of him as a person, and he's just in denial that his behavior reflects on his character at all. Also, it may have been that encounter or another, but I also made a point of showing Ron my cell phone. You see, at some point before that encounter, I had saved the phone number of, wait for it, the campus police, so that I could report him if needed. Not necessarily so the cops would arrest him, since they probably wouldn't actually have grounds, but I thought maybe I could at least sternly explain to him that he should leave people alone who don't want to be bothered. I flipped open my early 2000 Nokia in order to show him the entry for campus police, just to drive home the fact that I was not playing and was quite ready to escalate things to that level if he didn't leave me alone. You would think that would have been enough to get him to immediately disengage and walk away. Granted, that would have been great, but nope. He actually stuck around and continued attempting to try and argue and plead with me. Eventually, the interaction mercifully ended because I was finished with lunch, or anyway, I left. It was puzzling as hell, the whole damn scenario. Even some of my friends were wondering, why is he so desperate to be friends with someone who doesn't want to be friends with him? Anyway, I simply graduated college, so never had to see him again. He never tried to contact me after either, thank goodness, and on the other hand, being the petty guy I am, some small part of me almost wanted to look him up and send him a message. I would never actually do that though. But Ron, please, stop invading my privacy, and let's never meet again. I was 15 at the time, around 9 years ago. I lived with my parents in Lacey. I'm a pretty big stoner, and of course my parents didn't approve of this. Me being a minor at the time, we had just moved into a new house from my previous childhood home. The previous home had a good discreet smoke spot that was very close. In this new area, there were a couple of small parks which were good to go to smoke in private, without disturbing the public or being caught. However, they were a bit further away. I was big into longboarding and skateboarding at the time, and didn't get my driver's license and first car until I was 18, so I travelled by board or by bus generally. The mentioned parks are about 10 minutes away by board, so if you're hauling ass, which may not seem like it's very far, but when you're trying to have a quick smoke and resume what you're doing at home, it can be a bit of a burden. Especially, I try to avoid physical activity while smoking, as it isn't very good for your heart, and makes it work harder than it needs to. There are a few inclines on the road which makes it all more a chore to go back and forth on. This particular day, I was fed up with having to mob to the regular spots I would go to. I decided to go to this one spot I had never been to, but had seen in passing that was perhaps 5 minutes closer, in a large clearing off the side of a lesser thoroughfare, with houses surrounding its borders. There were some trees in front of the entrance from the sidewalk. It appeared to be some sort of undeveloped land with a small wildlife reserve of sorts or something like that. About 4 to 6 acres of tall grass with fenced houses belonging to different neighbours on 3 sides, with the sidewalk being the front for reference. It was during winter time, so it was getting dark at around 4 or 5 p.m. I don't remember exactly what time it was, maybe 3 p.m. or so. But I do remember it was starting to get a little dark, but not dark enough to be scared of anything yet. I approached the small tree line bordering the sidewalk and dismounted my board. I had my backpack which had all my smoking supplies, and I walked into the middle of the tall grass, making sure no police were driving by to witness me entering the area beforehand, just to be sure I wouldn't have to worry about anything. I sat down crisscross applesauce on my board, being positioned in the middle of the tall grass. I was facing the direction of the sidewalk and tree line, as I assumed that would be the only spot that I would need to keep a lookout for, primarily to keep an eye out for cops or nosy passers-by who might report some teenage kid lighting up. I don't remember what I did as I sat there, probably listening to music from my phone as I rolled the joint and enjoyed the scenery. It was pretty peaceful and secluded for about 30 yards away from a road, and I could see and hear the traffic faintly go by, being partially obscured from the trees. After rolling and smoking the joint, knowing me, I think I smoked a few more bowls out of my pipe. At this point I had lost myself in my newfound spot, quite satisfied with the solitude and safety it had provided me. It was probably around 3:40 at the time, and almost an hour had passed. I figured I should have probably wrapped up and gone home to play some video games. It was starting to get darker. By now the light in the sky was already fading, and had faded further. I couldn't see too far ahead of where I was looking due to the retreating light, already obscured by the ever-present gloomy clouds the area is known from. I started to pack up my stuff, zipping the marijuana and marijuana accessories in multiple Ziploc baggies and then some. It was kind of a chore with the whole bag system, but any stoner, especially minors living with parents, know that it's a necessary burden to bear, to not get caught by stinking up the house with the obvious aroma. As I was packing, I always kept my head on a swivel, as I naturally always kept my eye on my surroundings. I looked behind me and to my left opposite the road. As I was doing a 360-degree scan, what I saw made me immediately stop what I was doing. I saw what I believed to be a man walking towards me, and then he stood still as I noticed him. He was about 20 yards away when I first saw him. At first, I thought he was a resident of one of the homes which bordered the clearing I was in, coming to tell me off for what I was doing, or come to tell me he was going to call the cops. I'm a loud cougher when I smoke, so I figured I'd been caught. I soon realized that, like I said before, all the houses were surrounded by fences, and I didn't see any fences that had gates that you could walk through, so as to create easy access from people's backyards to where I was. So where this man had come from, I couldn't really tell. He just stood there not moving, but facing me he was. He didn't say a word. I couldn't make out what he was wearing. My vision isn't the best in the first place, even with my glasses, so I had no way of knowing if he was a resident, or perhaps some homeless man. A minute or so passed. Then, he suddenly resumed his walk towards me, without a word. He just walked towards me, at a normal pace, dead set on coming up to me, silently. I didn't want to find out what he had in mind. I threw everything in my backpack without finishing putting it all back in the baggies, packed up my board, and began running, quickly. I didn't look back, and skated as fast as I could home. Before entering my neighborhood, I resumed the rest of my bagging outside the street that enters my neighborhood. I didn't care if people saw. I just wanted to get my contraband secured and get the hell back to my house. I'm very glad I kept an eye on my surroundings. It is creepy that I am simply not sure where the man came from. If he was there the whole time and in hiding or what. I think what scared me the most was how silent he was as he approached me, with me having no idea what his intentions were. Driving in the backwoods in northern Georgia heading home, the moon is out, but this country-ass road has no streetlights, so basically my headlights are red. I can see silhouettes of things on the side of the road ahead of me. This massive shape comes out from behind a tree and begins squirming along the side of the road up ahead. I slow down and ponder if I want to go forward anymore, because while I had no idea what it is, I do know it's large, looks about as tall as my car, and just as long. I thought I saw spikes on the back and it's moving weird. I decide screw it and begin slowly going forward. I'm in the car. I can handle anything the state of Georgia can throw at me. Getting closer to the thing, I notice it's undulating funny. Turn ever so slightly to hit it with my headlights, and I see it's a deer trying to hump another deer, and I guess not quite getting there. I didn't stop laughing until I got home, because I was sure for a moment I was going to be attacked by some ancient, unspeakable horror. This happened a number of years ago, when I was in Naples, Italy with a friend. I go there a couple of times a year as my family lives nearby, but it was the first time I've ever gone there with only a female friend, Gabby. Prior to this trip, we were always accompanied by either my parents, my brother, or another male friend. Since I was practically raised in Naples, I knew the city very well, but it was Gabby's first time in Italy, so I wanted to show her interesting things. We went out every day. Immediately I started noticing that daily, at least a few times a day, guys would come up to us and make small talk. It felt weird, but we shrugged it off, thinking it was because we were young, not Italian-looking girls with crazy hair and styles. There were countless weird encounters throughout our whole stay in Italy, but I only want to focus on this one. Naples is a city that never sleeps, especially during the summer holidays. Adding to the fact that I knew the city very well, my family members we were staying with didn't object to us going out in the middle of the night. I decided to take Gabby to the walkway overlooking the sea. The street next to it was full of restaurants and bars, and we decided to sit down on a short wall that cut off the sidewalk from the beaches. We sat there for a while, talking and enjoying the view. Once we turned back to the sidewalk ready to go home, we saw two people approaching us. One was a teenager around our age, and the other was a gross-looking man in his 50s. The teenager was silent the whole time, but the man spoke after just staring at us for way too long. Since my friend can't speak Italian, I was the one who had to talk to the guy. He asked us how old we were. I told him we were both 15. I said that in a tone that would just make him leave, since we were clearly underage, but he kept going. He asked if we wanted to go out for a drink. I reminded him that we were both 15, and therefore too young. So he asked another question, if we wanted to go to his hotel room around the corner to smoke weed. That was when I freaked out. Clearly his intention was to lure us somewhere, but managed to only get us even more grossed out. I once again refused, but this time sharply said that we were really needing to get home, because I told my aunt that we had to be back by a certain time. We stood up and gave our goodbyes. When I was about to turn around, the guy grabbed my arm, looked at me, and said that he just wanted to teach him how to speak better Italian, gesturing to the teenager. I'm also creeped out that he didn't call him his son or friend or anything, just him. Then we walked away. I took the longer way home on purpose just to make sure he wouldn't follow. I still don't know what happened back then first. First of all, why didn't he come back after I told him? I still don't know what happened back there. First of all, why didn't he back up after I told him we were underage? Second, why would he come up to us in order to teach the boy Italian, since none of us are Italian looking, and you can clearly see we're tourists? And last of all, who was this boy? Was he with this man? And what would have happened if he came up to someone else? Maybe someone drunk, willing to go somewhere with him. After this happened to me, my friend and I started to be way more careful, while being approached by older men. We immediately just say, "Sorry, no Italian," which usually made them go away since they didn't want to struggle with speaking in English. Anyway, now I feel safer walking around Naples with my parents or a dude I know, because no one ever approaches me while being accompanied by other people. My name is Shen, and I live in France. This happened in 2017. Me and my half-brother wanted to drive through France, through Spain, and then take the ferry over to Morocco to spend some time with my half-brother's mum, who still lives there. So we start the journey down the French Riviera. 3 days of driving is what we expected, including, of course, the 2 nights at a hotel. Everything's going well in Spain. It is time to take the boat from the port of Malaga and go to Morocco, where we arrive at Tangier. It was around 5:30 when we got to the hotel in Rabat, a city in Morocco. We are settling in and everything is fine, but this is when it starts to get weird. In booking our rooms, the hostess was very helpful and professional. However, with my brother, we're starting to find it quite curious. What time exactly are you leaving tomorrow? Do you plan to take breaks on the road? Where exactly are you going? Where exactly is your car parked? She tells us to clean the car, and we just make a remark between my brother and I without really dwelling on it. The hostess asked us which road we were planning to take to get to Marrakesh. She suggested we take the road towards Casablanca, and is very insistent there without giving us time to answer. She told us that it would allow us to appreciate a beautiful landscape, and sadly, we followed the advice. It was the next day. The car had not been washed, and my brother and I were getting very tired. We slept until midday, and we decided to visit a little bit of Tangier before hitting the road. It's 10 p.m. now, and after eating we decide to hit the road. I prefer driving at night anyway. It's far more comfortable and there's less traffic. Everything's going really well, and we decide to listen to music and take breaks on some kind of highway. Having dragged around a bit and it getting late, we know we have 3 hours of road left before arriving. On the highway, there are very high lampposts, some of which aren't functional, so there were areas consumed with darkness. It was at these parts we needed to be extra vigilant. I saw a group of nobody around 7 or 8 guardrails, and I saw them quite quickly, crouching as if hiding and watching the cars. My brother at the time was already asleep. I kept driving without really asking myself a question, but I found it strange. So I switch on the full beams, and the moment I do, I see a man in the right lane. I was going at least 120-130 kilometers an hour on the center lane. I slowed down and reduced my speed to around 100, and the man in question must have been in his 40s. He rushed to my car, throws a rock at my windshield, and I smack the brake. I didn't understand what was going on. I stop by removing the belt, but my reflexes directs me towards the rearview mirror, where I see a dozen people running towards my car. It was hard to see in the dark, but I did see that their hands weren't empty. They appeared to have sticks, picks, and other things, and in fear I just stomped the accelerator. I speak to my brother at that moment while he's looking in the rearview mirror, but he doesn't answer. He's unconscious. His skull is wide open, blood flowing. The stone had been launched at his feet. I didn't know what to do. I try to put my hand at the level of the impact he had on his skull to reduce the blood flow while driving. I cry out his name, but he doesn't respond and doesn't react. It's late with no one on the road. The few cars that I do see don't stop. I do not know where we are. Where's the hospital? What I'm gonna do? A man comes up to me, looks at me, and I wave to him that I need help, and he stops. For context, I speak a bit of Arabic, but obviously mostly French. So, when I speak to the guy, he clocks quickly that I speak French, and tells me in French where the hospital is. But me, in my panic, can't really follow the directions, and he offers to come into the car with me and drive. He says that he just needs to go get his phone from his car so that he can get an Uber back to this spot later. My brother and the hospital are the only goals in my mind. I didn't really think much of it. He says apologetically for not introducing himself and says his name is Saeed, and to take the first exit after about 10 kilometers. I introduce myself by telling him my first name. It was at that moment I heard a strange noise while driving. I thought it was his phone, but it wasn't. The phone he had went to collect was in fact a walkie-talkie. Now, as I said before, I speak Arabic, and even though I tried speaking a few words of it, the guy obviously thought I couldn't speak it, which is why he spoke to me in French. He, over the walkie-talkie, starts speaking in Arabic. And the thing is, I'm Algerian, and for the most part, I can understand most of it. He didn't know this, and Saeed says to the guy, "It's not them, it's not them, it's not the right first name." The guy asks him if he's sure, and Saeed says, "Yes, she told us that his name was Mark." "He saw your face," the guy on the walkie-talkie says. "We'll have to get rid of him anyway." And he gives him an address to follow. At this point, I'm frozen. I'm looking at my brother, who is still unable to move. I try to find a solution to get out of this situation and remain calm. Saeed tells me not to take the planned exit, but the next one will be much easier. So I followed his instructions. If I had refused, he would surely have suspected something. So we passed the planned exit. 2 minutes go by. The most tense 2 minutes of my life. I see a vehicle that appears to belong to a certain police brigade. It is necessary to let them know I'm in danger, but how do I tell them? I decide to put myself at their level, but Saeed said I mustn't. I'm trapped, 5 meters away, so I decide to draw their attention with a flash of the 4 beams. They see that my windshield is destroyed, and they stop me. It's at this point Saeed starts to panic, and says to be careful and not get their attention, but at this point it was too late. They signal me to stop, and Saeed just says to me, "This isn't over," and runs from the car. I go to them in panic and explain the situation as best I can in Arabic. They call an ambulance which arrives quickly, and my brother is brought to the hospital and immediately is transferred to France to the Toulon military hospital, in which he will be put into an artificial coma for 3 weeks. His skull had been broken on the right side above his eye. He lost sight of the right eye, and today everything is better. He regained his sight little by little and slowly recovered. Saeed had not been found, but the man who threw the stone of 6.4 kilos was found and identified, and is known for several beatings in an organized gang, and is serving a 40-year prison sentence. And the most shocking revelation is yet to come. The woman who was the hostess was part of the coup, but she vanished. The inspector explained their way of working to me. The hostess spots people passing by the hotel who are foreigners. When she asks where the car is from and where it's transiting to, she gets their license plate so that they can recognize the target, which is why she asked us to go on the road via Casablanca. They rob people, get rid of them and take their cars. However, I explained the conversation between Saeed and the man who threw the stone. When he said to them, "It's not them, it's not the right name," the inspector told me that we were very lucky, and that he could not explain the situation to me on that. Perhaps they caught my brother's name, not mine. I decided to do some research on my own, and there have been stories like this where family and infants were attacked, but only the infants vanish. Trafficking, no doubt. In the end, I think they were wrong, because when the hostess asked us what time we were going to leave, I said we were leaving around 5 p.m, but we only left the hotel at 5, and we didn't hit the road until 10. They had our license plates, but not the people they expected, and the group of criminals were probably expecting other people than us. Myself and 2 others were invited to hang out with a buddy called Chris, as the other 2 were called James and Annie. It was around 11:15 when we arrived at his house, and upon our arrival we walked to his front door. I reached my hand out to knock on the door, and as soon as my fist made contact it flew open. An excited Chris greeted us with a loud hello, and we all greeted each other and then made our way into his home. We all sat in the living room, spoke for a few minutes when Chris says, "I'm so hungry." "Go eat something then," Annie said. We shushed him, and that's when James said, "How about we go get McDonald's?" As soon as those words left James' mouth, Chris jumped up and stood next to the front door. I stood there and made my way over to Chris. Annie sighed and stood up. I know she didn't want to go, but we'd pay for her. So we all got our jackets and shoes, and we left. The scary stuff happened when we were around halfway there. We walked for 10 minutes when we saw a lady wearing a white t-shirt and a bunch of different coloured stains on it and a pair of blue shorts that barely fit. As we got closer we realised she was talking, but no one was next to her. I remember a little bit of what she said. Something about Utah State and the lady next door. I was pretty paranoid and thought, as we walked past her, someone in the bushes was going to jump out and attack us. As we got closer I said loud enough for her to hear me, "Last one to McDonald's has to pay," and with that we all broke out into a sprint. Right before we passed her, Chris stopped right in front of the lady. As we walked towards Chris, I noticed she was talking to her. This is when I got a good look. It was dark, and all I could make out was a head of crusted black-brown hair. She had dark eyes that seemed to have something in them, and something that made me feel bad for her. She had brown rotting teeth and her breath smelled like death. I tapped Chris on the shoulder, but he pushed my hand away and was still engaging in conversation with the lady, who was known as Linda. "Where are you kids heading?" she said in her dry and raspy voice. "Just McDonald's," Chris answered. "How old are you guys?" Her face was twitching as well. 15. And then a huge grin appeared on her face. She slowly stood up, causing all of us to back away. She took a few steps closer, and with that we ran. She gave chase all the while screaming things like, "I'm not gonna hurt ya," and "Come on, you're scared of an old lady." She was frail and looked like a skeleton. I don't know how she was able to move at the speed she did. The big golden arches appeared in front of us and we ran in. She realized that she couldn't catch us, so she picked up a rock and launched it at us, and it hit me in the back. As we got closer to the McDonald's, we heard her screaming obscenities and that she was going to get us. We pushed through the McDonald's entrance and began panting. Annie slouched down into a seat with James, while Chris and I went to order. We got our food and we all sat down and ate in silence, as we were pretty shaken by what happened. Once we were heading back after we were done eating, we saw the lady at the gas station across the street, so we legged it so that she wouldn't see us. This happened last night, and honestly I'm still a bit shaken up about it. I work evenings as a dispatcher in a medium-sized Midwestern city. I was driving home at 2 a.m. when I stopped for gas. In retrospect, it was stupid to have stopped at all. The gas station was poorly lit and completely empty of any other customers, but I knew the shady areas of town, and this was usually not one of them. As I was pumping gas, I noticed a middle-aged woman sitting on the curb across the parking lot. It was a cold night, and had just started raining. The woman was not wearing weather-appropriate clothing, so she was drenched. When the woman saw that I was watching her, she called out to me from across the parking lot. My second of many stupid decisions that night was choosing to engage with her. I was worried for her, so I approached her to see what sort of help I could offer. "Hi, beautiful. I'm just trying to get home, but no one will help me. I'm trying to get into the city, but the cab ride is $60 and I only have 40. Can you help me?" I don't usually give money to panhandlers, but this woman seemed genuine. The weather was terrible, and my job centers around helping people, so I agreed. I told her I didn't have any cash, but if she would come inside with me, I'd take some money out of the ATM and give her a few bucks. But the ATM wasn't working. I apologized to her and told her there was nothing else I could do. She followed me back outside, idly chatting with me as I opened my driver door to get in. And then she got in my car. I was too shocked to really say anything. I sat staring at her as she buckled herself into the passenger seat, and as soon as she got into my car, her demeanor changed entirely. She no longer seemed forlorn as much as she did extremely excited and restless. "Just take me to my aunt's house. She can give me money," she said. Of course, alarm bells are going off in my head. Although my first instinct was to tell her to get the hell out of my car, my guts told me that would be dangerous. She'd already been proven to be unpredictable and seemed to be high, and I didn't know if she had any weapon on her. Forcing her out my vehicle, I thought, had the potential to elicit a violent reaction. "Where are you asking me to take you?" I finally said. "Just start driving. I'll tell you when to turn." "Nope. If you want me to consider driving you somewhere, I need you to tell me where we're going," I say with no real intention of driving her anywhere. "Don't worry, honey. I'm not a bad chick. I'm not gonna rob you. Just drive." "No. What's your aunt's address?" As I was asking her questions, she got really agitated. We still had not left the gas station parking lot, and I considered getting out of the car and going into the gas station for help. But A, she seemed to know and be friendly with the one attendant inside, and B, I wasn't about to leave her alone in my car. Finally, she snapped at me and said, "Why are you asking me so many questions? I thought we were friends. Don't you trust me?" "I work at the police department," I said. "It's my job to ask these sort of questions." She flipped out and started yelling at me about being a snitch, about trying to get her into trouble, and just generally losing her damn mind. At this point, I'm more scared than ever. I just wanted her gone, but my instincts still told me to get her out of my car. I decided to take a risk. I'm not a police officer. I just work at a police department. Why don't I take you to Walmart and see if they have an ATM that works? My idea was to get her out of the car as peacefully as possible, then lose her in the store. She liked my idea and immediately calmed down. I knew that driving off with this woman in my car was incredibly risky, but it seemed like my best option at the time. As we were driving, she kept talking to me. Her thoughts were erratic, bouncing all over the place. It sometimes seemed difficult for her to follow through with a thought, but this is roughly how our conversation went. I'm glad we're friends now. I have about 5 or 6 people trying to get me. I'm gonna come to your work tomorrow so we can arrest them. Okay, we can talk about it tomorrow. Tonight you said you're trying to get home? Yeah, honey, I'm really trying to get out into the sticks. The sticks? Thought you said you wanted to get to the city. Yeah, I meant the city. That's what I meant. That's why the cab ride's $40. It's far away. The cab ride's $40? Yeah, baby. You said you had $40. I do, baby, but I have $40. The cab ride's $60. And then there was silence. Are you sure you can't take me to my aunt's house, sweetie? She lives down on Fuller Road. That's not what you said before. Oh, no, baby, I'm sorry. Oh, it doesn't matter. She won't give me the money anyway. You sure you can't just take me to the city? It was terrifyingly obvious that this woman was utterly full of crap, because the details of her story were constantly changing. When we pulled into the Walmart parking lot, she finally got out of my car, only after I left first and followed me to the store. I told her before we went to find an ATM that I needed to use the restroom. My plan was to call the police from inside the store, but she followed me into the bathroom, and that's when things got really weird. She grabbed onto the crook of my arm and whispered in my ear, "If you don't have any money, that's okay. But let me ask you something, sweetie. Do you like being eaten out?" I told her no as forcefully as I could manage, bolted into a stall and then locked the door as fast as I could possibly manage. As soon as I had a barrier between us, I said, "You know, I have some friends at the police department that could probably help you better than I can. I'm just going to call them and see if we can figure this out together." Again, at the mention of the cops, she began screaming at me, and I just kept reiterating that the police would help. She snapped at me and said she was going to leave and stormed out, but it wasn't over. I waited to make sure she was really gone. Sure enough, not 60 seconds after she left, she came into the bathroom and started banging on the stall door, and she said something that scared me more than anything else. "Hey, come back to your car with me. I left my beer in your car." I blatantly tell her no. I saw her get into my car and she had absolutely nothing with her, other than the clothes on her back. After that, she left the bathroom again and didn't come back. I waited a good 5 minutes before exiting the bathroom. I immediately found a manager who called the police for me. Thankfully, I was in a different police jurisdiction from the one I worked in because I was mortified at how entirely stupid I had been for the whole night and would have died of embarrassment if a co-worker had responded. The officer that responded took my statement and advised me to be more careful in the future. He said that sometimes panhandlers turn violent, and that, just recently, there had been a woman who matched my description assaulting a Good Samaritan that had stopped to try and help her. I definitely learnt my lesson on stranger danger, and I'm lucky to have come out unscathed. I'm glad my stupidity didn't kill me. So, fellow listeners, the next time you try and help out a stranger late at night, don't. This happened when I was 14 years old. My family ran a summer camp of sorts where we invited kids from Korea and China over to our house in the US for a few months. We would go on tours of the country showing them landmarks and famous attractions. One of the stops along our tour of the East Coast was the famous museum, the Smithsonian. The day we visited, I was not feeling too great. The road trip was long. I was packed in the back of my car with a bunch of strangers, and I had a nosebleed right before we had to step out the car. Even though the Natural History Museum was my favorite place in the world, the combination of feeling sick made me want to get away, and after speeding through the exhibits, I went to the bathroom to calm down. I didn't feel like walking, so I sat down in the rotunda with an elephant on it, waiting for my family and guests to finish up the tour. While I was sitting, a short woman sat down next to me on the bench and began touching my shoulders. She began to speak to me in Korean, asking my name, my birthday, and a whole lot of other personal info. I was mostly confused and gave vague, short answers. The whole time she was rubbing my shoulders and generally acting way too close. When I saw her face, she had a sad expression in her eyes. I didn't feel any malice, but it was still very weird. Over time, I grew more and more uncomfortable, and I stared straight at the ground, hoping my parents would hurry up. Eventually, she got up and left, and one of the guests showed up to tell me they were leaving soon. The more I thought about it afterwards, the weirder it felt. I had been alone for several minutes by the time she showed up, so it was strange that she already knew I spoke Korean. She also treated me like we were family, and left without a word. I didn't think I was in real danger due to being in full view of crowds and cameras, but it's an unexplained experience that has struck me for many years. This happened to me about 10 years ago, and stays with me vividly as one of the weirdest things I've ever experienced, and I don't usually believe in paranormal things. Our family were renovating a very old house in rural Australia, over 100 years old, which we were about halfway through the renovation. We were staying in another small outhouse while doing the renovation, but we had family and friends coming to stay with us, so I had to forfeit my normal bedroom and stay in the main house in a tent, as it was nowhere near ready to sleep in. Most of the nights, I woke around 3 a.m. to our working dogs about 200 meters away from the house, going absolutely nuts barking at something, but I usually didn't pay much attention to them, as kangaroos often jump near their kennels and set them off some nights. As their barking came to a stop, I could faintly hear crisp and clear footsteps out the room I was in and down the hallway, getting louder and clearly slower, making their way towards my room. I didn't think much of it at first, but the direction the noise was coming from was so clear. The footsteps slowly made their way up to the room and hallway and stopped at what I thought to be the doorway of the room. I was locked up with fear at what the hell was standing in the doorway and trying to figure out what I could do, and then it started moving again, only this time straight towards my tent and stopped right next to it. And I was waiting for the tent to start shaking, but it only stopped for a brief second and then walked into the corner of the room and stopped. The fear I felt at that moment kept me paralyzed for what felt like hours. I was sweating and had a blanket over me and was too afraid to move. After a while, I eventually calmed down enough to get my light I had with me, open the zippers of the tent, and look out, to which I found nothing in the room. So I climbed back into the tent and somehow managed to get back to sleep, as I never heard anything more. In the morning, I woke up fairly early and went back over to the little outhouse and tell my parents my story and asked them if they were just messing with me, but they were adamant they didn't do anything. To add to the strange noise of the footsteps, there were loose floorboards all over the hallway floor, drying out, spaced tightly together, getting ready to be put down in the coming weeks. So I decided to try and replicate those footstep noises, but couldn't, as the boards on the floor would move and make completely different sounds. To this day, I'm still not sure if it was just my head playing tricks on me, or if there was something strange going on in that house.